Okay, I think I'm live. Might have to throw headphones in. Oh, look at that. I didn't change my thing. Here we go. There it is. We got it done. We gotta have the little wooey Luke in the corner. Right. Kalepa. Thank you, brother. Kalepa is the one who made this for me. Why? It's backwards. Left, right brain stuff. Okay, there's a few things I want to talk about this morning. I have the time and the capacity, and so I'm going to talk about them. And then we'll open it up if people show up and want to chat about it, and it'll be good. So, someone spoke with me recently. So, my two inspirations for this live stream, or the main two inspirations, forgive me, I'm still getting over my cold, is are this interview with, who's telling me about this? Pavel Shelin, Pavel Shelin, who I first heard about. Maybe I heard about it from my friend Sarah. I can't remember because he spoke with John Heers, who's kind of corner adjacent. And then he had a conversation with Jordan Greenhall. No, maybe it was McMo who told me about it. Because he's been popping into my salience, into the corner conversations a little bit here and there. He's I don't know, how does he describe himself? He's like a Russian PhD guy who knows a lot of English, and so he's just he's a very interesting conversation partner within these realms, within this arena, in the global landscape today. And I think whoever told me about it said he said some things that really made Jordan Hall have some epiphanies and some clarity about stuff, which was interesting. So I started listening to that, and they have one thing in here, which is something I really want to talk about, which is essentially Jordan Hall's paradigmatic mind versus his transcendent mind. And that's something that Jess and I have talked about, which is where paradigmatic mind is where you're switching from paradigm to paradigm, which is map to map, map to map to map to map. So left, right brain, right? The map and the territory. You have an understanding of reality, of what is, of the world, that helps you to navigate the world, but it's not synonymous. It's not identical to what the world is. So that's why it's the map and it's not the territory. And your left brain operates in maps. And so a paradigm, a framework, a way of seeing the world is a narratival interpretation of the world that helps you to navigate the world. But I would argue that it's necessarily utilitarian because it assumes or presumes maybe a goal. Like I have a map for a reason. So it's a reason-oriented way of operating in the world. Paradigms are nested within a reason-oriented way of being in the world. So that's paradigmatic mind. And then transcendent mind is the mind that I would say is where the right brain is the master. It's what I call iconic knowing. It's where it's the non-duality that includes duality. So you can have paradigms, but your way of operating in the world is not limited to the totalizing Ouroboros of the map of the paradigm. It's not a mechanistic, systemic thing. It's a tonal thing. And Jordan Greenhall talked about that. I think he was speaking with my boy Jess about this a few times, at least. He's probably spoken about it other places. But he used the illustration of rhythm, where you have a beat like. But then if you speed that up exponentially, and it just goes into an ohm, into like a tonal thing, which makes me think of my boy Raj and Sikhism and meditation. But like the it's that tonal reality where it's not a switching. If the switching gets fast enough, it's almost like the calculus of of frameworks, or calculus of mode switching. You change into like a tone, and then you can have, and then if you relate that to intimacy, you can have harmonic tones, and you can make music. In your thinking, you can end up making music. It wasn't me. It was standing in the corner. Wasn't me. Oh, I was gonna sing Chad's song too. I'm just a Midwest Metacrisis. So that's one clip that I want to talk about because I think that it's illustrative of this quote that I like, because I timestamped it on this conversation and I put the quote in there. In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. Chekhov. I don't even know who this guy is. But it's a hell of a quote. It's a good one. Or like, all models are false, some are useful. That's a super succinct quote that I think I learned from Rob Bell. Here you go, the emergent conversation. I'm pretty sure the first place I ever heard that was Rob Bell. Also, this is why I don't like Nick Freewheeling, if you're here, this is why I don't like it when conservative people that came out of evangelicalism shit on Rob Bell, because Esther Meek, Little Book of Knowing, she's come into the corner recently. You know where I first heard of Esther Meek in that book? Rob Bell. You know where I first heard, what was I? Oh, all models are false, some are useful, which is basically like a super succinct way of talking about all the McGilchrist stuff. I mean, you could read like a 900-page book from McGilchrist, which is great. Do it, fine, whatever. If you have to do it, you have to do it. Or you could just know all models are false, some are useful. What's that mean? Models are used for reason-based utility, but they're not synonymous with reality because they're false. There you go. There's a pithy little phrase that says it all if you just think about it for a while. Yeah, shit on Nick instead of Rob Bell. Just kidding, Nick. I love you. I just don't. But why is related to the next video that I'm going to play. So the next video is I was talking to McMo about this cat, but OG Rose. I don't know this guy personally. I know he comes in the corner a little bit. McMo said he's kind of part of another emergent online community that tends to be a little bit more, believe it or not, tends to be a little bit more evangelical than intellectual. Probably not evangelical. Tends to be a little bit more intellectual than the TLC. And but this is where I'm going to push. I don't know. This is my super contrarian nature. Whatever group I find myself in, I like wherever people are congregating and normalizing. I find myself on the outside. And I just do that instinctually. Because I'm always wanting to push into the fringe, into the chaos. And it's probably because I like transcendent mind, and I always have, instead of paradigmatic mind. I am not the kind of temperamental conservative that finds safety and protection in herd stuff. And there's wisdom in that, right? Jordan Peterson talks about this, like even intellectual herd mentality, because evolutionarily, right? If you don't blend into the rest of the herd and you're on the outside, or you're a straggler, or you look a little different, right? Like there's a herd, is a herd the right term? There's a herd of horses, and then there's a zebra. Like a lot of beige, think like buckskin horses, what do they call them? Whatever. And then there's a word I'm not remembering. This is showing how I don't have my Western South Dakota ranch cred good enough. But if you're a zebra, you're going to stand out and you're going to get picked off by a predator. Or if you're on the outside, you're going to get picked off by a predator. I get that. But that's kind of the way that I tend to operate. And then it's also why, though, in the modern parlance of modernist identitarianism, where we equate our self-identity to abstract ideas as like the primary center of our identity, That's that other quote that I like to say, which is, the last remaining acceptable form of bigotry is against those with whom you disagree. That's people that are outside the bounded set of the ideas that you think make you orthodox in whatever category. So if somebody's outside that, they're heterodox, and they're outside the protective, normal, central mode, and then they can get picked off by predators. Like, it's dangerous out there. But however, sometimes the cave you fear to enter holds the answer that you seek. And sometimes salvation comes outside the camp. So, okay, OG Rose. So I've been talking to McMo about this lately, and it's the anti-intellectualism that's within the TLC. And this is where I find myself in a spiral, starting to come back and push back on this side. Is I've spoken against propositionalism forever in certain modes of epistemology. I think in my definition that I have, or in my video description, I have in there kenotic or relational epistemology, because that's one of the central ideas that I want to get at in this video, which I think OG Rose talks about beautifully well, intellectually, in this video that I'm going to play, which Demir clipped. I think I put Demir's clip in the, I'm going to play it directly from his video, but because it doesn't have Demir's backing music. But I saw it through Demir, so thank you, Doomer. Because here's the thing, right? You can be right and be wrong, or be wrong and be right. You can hold to all the correct ideas in a reason first, truth first approach, and you can do it. Again, that's adverbial, right? Like, I like these things. I am whatever. Fill in the blank. I'm Orthodox. I'm Catholic. I'm Protestant. I'm Jewish. I'm atheist. Whatever. All that's ideological. I'm man. I'm woman. Whatever binary you want to do. Also, Michael Sartori did a great video on binaries that I don't even think I finished the other day. I started, but I haven't finished. Great video. I didn't put that in the link either. I'm remembering other things that I don't have in the link. But those binaries, again, that's a paradigmatic thing. It's a binary, this or that. It's back and forth. It's a paradigm. This is right or this is right. Transcendent mind isn't playing that either or game. But they are not. They're doing both. The non-duality that includes duality. You can self-identify along certain labels. I am a man. I am Orthodox. I am a father. I am white. I am, I grew up poor. I grew up rural in West or South Dakota. I grew up politically conservative. I grew up whatever, all these different things. And you can identify and you can totalize your identity upon one of those adjectival identity markers. Or you can live in the place of iconic thinking or transcendent mind, where you simultaneously can identify with those markers but not be limited by them, which is why they're icons. They are images that push you further up and further into transcendent things. All right, I think I'm going to play the clips. I'll maybe stop them some, and then I'll open it up. Because again, I feel uncomfortable because of my Protestant work ethic for doing these things more than an hour and a half. So I will have to move on to other things. All right, which one should we start with? I think I'm going to have more to say about the OG Rose thing, because I think I said basically all I want to say about the other one. But let's start with that. Nope, not invite. Not doing that yet. Let's start with the Metacrisis. 1, 2, Okay, is this working? Here we go. Who's super angry? Parlato, you're super angry? What up, Michael? Okay, let's go. Let's play.
I live in now is quite meaningfully different from the world that I grew up in ways that are palpable.
Let's go back.
And so
I didn't have my volume fixed.
Meaningfully different from the world that I developmental life. Like, the world I live in now is quite meaningfully different from the world that I grew up in ways that are palpable. And so what this does is this has impacts on psychology. The kind of mind that can form and adapt and respond to the world that it's in actually has to be a different kind of mind. You have to be a mind to that middle period where cultures would maybe say 2 or 3 generations and would drift. This is a paradigmatic world. This is a world where we can build large-scale cultural models that sort of look like pseudo-reality by the 3rd generation.
Okay, let's talk about some of this stuff. Because, okay, he's saying the world now is different than the world that he grew up in. And you have to, this is why I love that quote. In times of change, the world has changed. Largely because of medium, largely because of Gutenberg 2.0, the internet, long-form conversations, video. The medium is different. I said this to McMo the other day. Maddie Diaz, I'm going to talk about Maddie Diaz because I love her music. She has a song that is same person, old place. And the chorus is like, because you can't be the same person or you can't be a different person in an old place. That's medium and message. If nothing changes, nothing changes. If you don't change your context in some way, your text won't change. You won't see anything new. It won't be salient to you. Nothing will be different if the medium doesn't change. Something has to open up because otherwise reciprocal narrowing, reciprocal opening. Okay? So like in times of change, learners, people who can learn, people who have made themselves adverbally into learners who can change, inherit the earth because things have changed. While the learned, adjectival, the people who knew everything in the old paradigm found themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. Okay. Sorry, primarily Gutenberg type people, literal type people. The old institutions are built on the literal. That's why we say that. It's a tell psychoanalytically. The written word, Socrates' lament of the written word, it will make you forget the institutions of the world that is passing away, that no longer exists, is rooted in propositional written articulation. This is going to point to what O.G. Rose says in the next conversation, what I mean by kenotic relational epistemology. The epistemology is not rooted in the text. Proper knowledge is not rooted in the text. It's not rooted in quoting anyone. It's rooted in knowing as you are known. It's rooted in relationships. It's rooted in intimacy. Okay, let's go back to Jordan Hall.
But by the 4th or 5th generation, they're beginning to break. We have to have some process of modifying and transitioning, which of course means things like giant educational institutions, which can codify, professionalize, and regularly download paradigms on minds and convert human beings into things that can run paradigms effectively and become part of.
Convert human beings into things that can run paradigms effectively. What's that sound like? Ideological possession. And notice how he's talking about these institutions in terms of scale. This is why all institutions are inherently demonic. Bodies don't operate in terms of scaling. Because, I mean, who talked about this? Seabax and Jordan Hall. The difference between scaling and growth. Tumors kind of scale. I mean, they don't scale exponentially, but it is identical replication. That's what a tumor does. It's just cancer cell, cancer cell, cancer cell, cancer cell, cancer cell. It's not a pluripotent stem cell that can become anything. That can become anything related to the body in which that stem cell manifests. Okay, let's go back.
Our paradigmatic machine. But as you move into the 21st century,
this is my problem with confessionalism, paradigmatic machines. Confessionalism, again, don't fall into the binary. I'm fine with a confession as long as it's an icon, as long as it's open to change, as long as it's a living thing, a Talmud, a living body. If it's a living body, it's a good thing. If it requires identical replicationism and thought policing, and you have to use my words, I'm not going to use your words, Jordan Peterson. That's what it is. It's ideological possession. It's just, you have to, what did he just say? Let's go back. What did he say?
Effectively and become part of minds and convert human, professionalize and regularly download paradigms on minds and convert human beings into things that can run paradigms effectively and become part of a paradigm.
Convert human beings into things that can run paradigms effectively. Download the paradigm the static confession, the operating procedure, you're a robot. This is why you're an NPC. I am not saying that to piss you off. I'm just saying, like, if you're not a human being. Again, it's an identical replicant. Like, you're possessed by a power and a principality. I mean, I know that's going to piss people off. I can't help it.
Paradigmatic machine. But as you move into the 21st century, the rate and magnitude of change is too fast for that entire architecture. And so we have to move into some novel moment. So that's one big, gigantic chunk, but that's a novel moment. We're actually in a point that is completely different qualitatively in the nature of what kind of human mind is necessary and capable of responding to the world that we're actually living in and living in more and more, and what kind of cultural fabric is able to respond and connect with that mind. That's an entirely new problem that we're in right now.
Okay, that's that. Learners inherit the earth. Learners. What is a learner in relation to like a static propositional confessional thing? Like, I don't, if you it's very much the McLuhan thing and the literal word and the written word and Gutenberg, and it's a monofocal thing. I think actually OG talks about that really well in this conversation, because I think he talks about the embodiedness of sense perception. I don't know, he speaks about it really well. OG, he's like I'm more of a shamanistic kind of visionary, weird, psychedelic without psychedelics type person, and OG is a very like high level intellect analysis, explaining things. But then this will get into, and I don't know him personally, but this is where I will get into a potential where somebody like OG could be right but be wrong. So let's play his clip. Here we go. Share screen. Make it biggie. Make it biggie. Okay, I think we're right here.
Struggle to overstate how important conversational skill is. How many marriages end up in disaster because of a lack of conversational skill? Not hate. It ends up in hate because of a lack of conversational skill and misunderstanding. But what is the root of so many problems? That's good.
Okay, I have to say a few things because I'm thinking of quotes as people talk. My mind is working like this in a tonal way. Graham Greene quote. Also, guess where I first heard this before I ever read this book? From Rob Bell. Weird. I heard this from Rob Bell, and then I read Graham Greene, The Power and the Glory, and then all of a sudden, this quote that I had heard from Rob Bell, boom, it was right there on the page. Hate is a lack of imagination, which just ties in beautifully with George MacDonald's essay on the imagination. And also, I think it was Phlebas who on Twitter posted, here's another link, a hyperlink in my video that I don't have linked in my description. But Malcolm Geit, I haven't finished this either. I probably will today. Malcolm Geit. Oh, I should. Okay, I got to do a few things. I'm going to find the video, the Malcolm Geit video. When was I listening to it? On enchantment and the imagination. The wonder of Tolkien. They're talking about Tolkien. So I will copy that. I will go into my video here. Talking about Tolkien. I hear myself talking, which is obnoxious. Okay, here's the Malcolm Geit conversation. I'm putting into the conversation if you want it. So that link, I just put into the conversation. That's that Malcolm Geit conversation on Tolkien and enchantment in the essay. So back to OG. Hate, a lack of communication. How many relationships and marriages fall apart because of a lack of communication and an inability to communicate? Okay, he hasn't even gotten to the main point of why I wanted to clip this yet. But many. And hate isn't a lack of imagination. Or as I've said before, hate and love are not opposite. It's almost more like hate and apathy, or love and apathy are opposites. If you hate something, you really love it. You because you're libidinally connected to it. you just, there's something in it that there's a disharmony. There's something that is off in the resonance between the thing, the object that you are loved. There's probably some sort of Lacanian object A stuff going on in here. I don't know. Charlie, are you in? Okay, C Money is texting me, but $1 million. Okay, sorry, I'm taking a break. Relax, because I love Charlie. I love playing with him, and I hope he comes in here to talk and play. But this is this is privilege. This is hierarchy. Currently live streaming, Charlie. Watch. So what was I saying? It distracted me. What was I just talking about? Darn it. Steven, you're here, buddy. Great. Taya, William, good to see all you guys. Okay, let's go back and play his thing. Oh, hate and love. Yeah, Lacanian. You're maybe libidinally connected to this objected thing. But here's the thing. If you have this kenotic, relational love of this thing, I actually think that's why you start to hate stuff. Is because you're stuck in the paradigmatic mind. You're insisting on your own way. You're stuck in your ideas about the thing. John Mayer. I quoted this the other day in Seaback's conversation that will come out eventually because we recorded one the other day. Who do you love? Me or the thought of me? Me or the thought of me? John Mayer. Who do you love? Me or the thought of me? Because the thought of me is not me. That's paradigmatic mind. That's your idea of me. You're treating me as an object. I want you to treat me as a person because persons are meant to be loved, not to be used. Paul, you see, this is why I say all the stuff I'm talking about, PBK, you already know. You just don't know that you know. Because when you say that, human beings are meant to be loved, not to be used, that's exactly what I'm talking about. There is no utilitarian paradigmatic mode of interacting with people. And that's where you're going to fall into hate because this person is acting toward you in a way that you can't anticipate and map. And it looks like chaos to you, and so you hate it. But here's the thing. If you learn to operate within iconic thinking and transcendent mind, and you learn to know as you are known, that hate in humility, you can receive with meekness the implanted word, and you can give of yourself up and not insist on your own way, and you can learn to want what you don't want. Not my will, but your will. It's so good. Just free your mind. The rest will follow. Okay, let's go back. OG Rose.
So many problems that people have in their life. Well, Chekhov put it very well. He said, the problem with people of whom love one another is that they're constantly misunderstanding one another. And basically all of Chekhov's plays are based upon that premise. One can go through Chekhov and see over and over again a recapitulation of the reality that the more people love one another, the more likely they actually are to misunderstand one another. Oddly, you don't tend to misunderstand strangers. That's something Chekhov claimed, and he kind of laughed about. We don't really misunderstand strangers.
Okay, this part. It's easier to misunderstand someone that you know intimately and love. I think this is eminently true. This is so true for myself. The most difficult people, I mean, the people that I have the most difficulty in talking to and understanding are the people I love most clearly. The person who I feel like most times misunderstands me the absolute most is my wife. Holy moly. Like, that is just so clear. But in that, this is why it's henosis by kenosis. This is why your suffering, your existential suffering of that lack of communion by the people you love most dearly is not a curse. To be blessed is to be cursed as well. To be cursed is to be blessed as well. That curse is what is leading you into humility and forgiveness and repentance, which is salvation. That is your very salvation. Receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. It's easier to misunderstand the people that you know most intimately versus a stranger. If you find yourself really misunderstanding strangers, I don't know. My knee-jerk reaction is that you got a lot of work to do. If you can't even understand a stranger, how are you going to understand? I think this is right. It's a counterintuitive truth, but I think it's very true. All right, let's go.
Because a recapitulation of the reality that the more people love one another, the more likely they actually are to misunderstand one another.
So good.
Oddly, you don't tend to misunderstand strangers. That's something Chekhov claimed, and he kind of laughed about. We don't really misunderstand strangers because we just move on. We don't really deeply tarry with what they said. If we don't understand what the stranger said, we just move on to the next thing. We had a conversation with them. In fact, with strangers, you tend to understand their intent. Their intent is they're trying to speak to me. Okay, great. Yeah. And you move on. It's with loved ones that the meaning cares more to you, right? With strangers, you're not really listening for the meaning so much. It doesn't really bother you if you don't understand everything they're saying. There are not stakes, right? But with loved ones, you move to a relationship of communication where you're more so trying to get the meaning. And often, unfortunately.
Okay. I'm going to interject here. I'm going to let him keep talking because he says this beautifully. But here's the problem, right? And this is why I think PVK is the center of the TLC and the randos are the center of the TLC, and why TLC is about participation and knowing as you are known. And this gets into my conversation with CBAX that we have about Christian YouTube and TLC and scale. And honestly, like, why I'll play a clip from OG Rose or Jordan Hall or something, but like, truthfully, this is true. And I don't think I'm bullshitting myself. I really don't. I don't have any desire to talk to Jordan Green Hall. It's not because I dislike the guy or I don't know that we'd get along. I don't know. He's a little, I don't know. It would be fun to see him not in an intellectual conversation, to see how he lets his hair down. Because I like people who want to shoot the shit. I like people that are silly, play, fun boys. I like, Chad McMo. I was talking to McMo yesterday on the phone, our first phone call. We had a beautiful phone call. McMo got to see my son. He paid me. He Venmo'd me $20 because that's a super membership perk. That's a joke. But here's the thing, so this is what's funny about the Jordan Hall conversation, or like, this is my problem with Christian YouTuber scale or like reaching up too much, is because of this very thing that he talks about. You most understand people you don't know, or you think you understand because there's this savings throw principality spell that's put on you that you think you can understand people through the mammon, the transactional mode of just language, non-relational language, right? Because medium and the message, the text and the context. The text is, like, even now with OG Rose, I would say what he's saying, ironically, what he's saying, I don't understand in the way that I would understand if I had a relationship with OG Rose. But a relationship with OG Rose requires embodiment. It requires incarnation. It requires time. It requires sacrifice. I don't know how much you can really understand someone, again, because everything requires initiation. You have to be initiated into a body in order to understand it. To understand the English language, you have to be initiated into the body of English. To understand mathematics, you have to be initiated into the body of mathematics. To understand a person, you have to be initiated into their body and participate with their body where it manifests. And maybe for a human being, the deepest level of that intimacy is maybe the two becoming one flesh, marriage, right? And part of that, at least for corporeal, physical human beings, would be, this is why with your wife. This is why my wife doesn't understand. Like, she does and does not understand me. She has no interest in any of this stuff. She doesn't want to listen to any of this stuff. I mean, this is what I tell her sometimes. Like, whatever. I have 30 people watching this right now. I can't get people in my family to listen to me for 5 minutes. Like, it's unbelievable. But in that is the seed, is the hidden, buried seed of the blessing of it within that suffering. Because part of me, this is why I have to learn to want what I don't want. Very often the narrative, the paradigm that I tell myself that I most want is, I was just saying this yesterday to McMo, I would love for my wife to love this stuff. And not necessarily because she loves it per se in and of herself, but because she loves me, and so she gives of herself and disciplines herself to pay attention to this stuff because she knows I love it and I will feel loved. Because in a sense, that's kenotic, that's self-emptying love, right? But the reality is she doesn't want to, because she has, my wife's awesome. She's doing lots of things, but in that, this is the dance of self-emptying love. I can't demand that of her, and then if she doesn't give me that, start resenting and hating her for that. Because then my love and my desire of her to love me would turn into not love, Christ and Antichrist. Okay, let's go back to OG.
Unfortunately, we find there isn't meaning, or they're trying. But with loved ones, you move to a relationship of communication where you're more so trying to get the meaning. And often, unfortunately, we find there isn't meaning, or there's a hidden narcissism, or the meaning is that we have no idea what we're doing, right? And so we find ourselves in conversation constantly misunderstanding one another because we've never been trained on how to communicate meaning, and we've never even determined our own meaning, or the own meaning of our own lives that we have from our own childhood traumas, that is narcissism or something like that. And so we find ourselves like two serpents locked. What did Chesterton say? You know, marriage is a duel to the death that no one of honor will turn down. And indeed, much of great literature is simply approaching from different angles. The great irony that the more we love people, the more we find ourselves misunderstanding them. But because we misunderstand them, that's why they can be an infinite source of mystery and beauty. Because if we could entirely understand them, then the book would be closed. Misunderstanding, as difficult as it might be, is precisely the prerequisite necessary for the in-betweenness by which we can approach a horizon that is not reducible to human instrumentation. So there are silver linings to these difficulties. I would also note, and then I'll pass it to Michael, Jacob, and Dimitri, I think we are in the age, I love that idea of setting the rules of the conversation by which one does not follow through. I think we're in the age of dialogue technology. Zoom affords infinite innovation of dialogue technologies, where if you're honest, for most of history, the only dialogue technology we had was the debate. You had conversation and debate, and that was about it, right? I'm not saying that was literally it, but generally it was very limited. Well, now that we have this technology, one could imagine setting up many rules. And also the critical thing with that example, if you go into a conversation and just introduce that without everyone knowing those are the rules, they'll probably be upset. But if you have like 5 rooms, and here is Jonathan Rouse, Ralston has some dialogue structures, right? He has the anti-debate, I think he calls it, right? So room A is an anti-debate. Room B is what Christian described. And here are the rules. Select your room, right? Then people would know what they were getting on and thus have permission to engage in that way of conversation without causing offense or misunderstanding, right? I honestly do think we are now in the Zoom age, the oral tradition, the written tradition, the Zoom tradition. You certainly have, who knows how many possible dialogue experimentation that set different rules for engagements that may unlock different ways of engagement that could afford who knows what. And look, it also should just be noted, I'm always struck when you look at society, because there's always this idea of, oh, come on, do we really want to put that much stake in conversation? Because there's all
right, he goes, if you want, the link for this video is down below, and he keeps going. I don't know what he says. OG is like me, where he's just like, okay, I'm going to say one more thing, and then I'll pass it on to my person. And then it's just like, okay, but then his mind keeps going, because his mind is what did Elon say the one day? Like, his mind is a, what does he say? Like a torrent or a fire or something. Yeah. That's where people think, and maybe they're right. I don't really care that I have ADHD and I get borderline manic. But again, the context, this is a specific mode for me. So like when I'm doing this, when I get into intellectual thinking mode, I'm just like, I'm not like this all the time. This is what I said. I was saying to McMo yesterday. I'm a silly, fun playboy. I like to joke around. I like to be very physical. I like to eat and drink wine. So, all right, I'm gonna open this boy up, look at comments, see what people have to say, and chat for a little while. Tayo, what's up, buddy?
Hi there, Luke. I used my unhand privilege to sort of jump in ahead of everyone else.
Hey,
Just waiting for you to say you'll drop the link.
perks.
Yes. Appear on screen.
Perks.
wasn't
What do you have
even
to say,
that close.
brother?
I've got a few. I was actually taking notes, believe it or not, just because I think
Holy moly.
this stream is a good capture of a lot of the things you're always trying to say about personalism and iconic thinking as such. Firstly, starting, hi Gavin. This might take me 20 minutes or so. So not sorry. I want to start with the static paradigm and I think was it transgetic paradigm.
Well, Jordan Halls are paradigmatic, where you're going back and forth with the rhythm, into transcendent, where to a tone, like, and that's my iconic thinking. Yeah.
And I think is what you're saying is that's sort of aided by the podcast revolution and live stream conversations.
I think what I would say is that that mode of consciousness is emerging because of the shift in the medium. Because because of the OG video, because you have to start interacting with people. Because I think when TLC, we're interacting with people more relationally. Like, this is what I said to Nathan Orman so many years ago. It's deeper than ideas. It's about the persons. And then you start seeing things differently because you have that deeper level, harder understanding that OG's talking about.
And the deeper level of understanding is what will allow you to get access to the truth that you know. So I've got a quote here written down. You said something like, "All the stuff I'm telling you, you already know. You just don't know that you know."
Mm-hmm.
And the way you get to know that is by thinking in an iconic way rather than the static way. Correct?
Yeah, in a self-emptying way, not insisting on your own way. You know, Paul in 1 Corinthians says that love does not insist on its own way. So when you really love someone, you don't insist, like what I was talking about my wife, you don't insist on your own paradigm and what you want. You have to give up what you want, you know?
Okay. And then, so that gets us to the idea of it's easier to misunderstand someone that you know than a stranger. And I
Yep.
think the reason for that is because of the category of a stranger. And I think, as you explained, that you're not looking to be able to apprehend the meaning of whatever the stranger is saying. You just sort of stop at the level of they're trying to communicate with me, and I can't access that, so I'm not going to do any further investigating. Correct? Am I tracking so far?
I mean, I think that's some of it. Yeah, you don't have any, they don't really demand anything of you. Like Tim Keller
Oh,
said
they
this one.
do. You're just not able or willing to engage.
Maybe, yeah, but you don't have enough context. You don't have enough relational time to have any sort of like woundedness. It doesn't really require that much humility. This is why I said the people that are just disagreeing with people they don't even know are like, it looks like dire straits to me, because like, to even entertain someone who holds a different opinion than you, who you don't have a relationship with, like that's kind of pretty basic level elementary stuff as far as I'm concerned. To communicate with somebody that you have context with and relationship with who's hurt you, like that requires a lot more humility.
And I think this is sort of why in chat I said earlier that personalism is bad for good conversation, because if, as you just said, the only people you're able to communicate or have conversation with are people you already know enough to have conversation with, then the stranger will always remain a stranger because you're not willing to engage the stranger, because you don't believe they've got anything valuable that you're able to get from them, because what's in you is not able to apprehend what they're trying to say.
Well, I just think that's the nature That's just the nature of the way things go, though. Like you can't. It's the nature of hierarchies and your own finitude and your being embodied. Like it doesn't mean they don't have anything to offer you, but like you can't, because of the limited nature of who you are, you can't talk to everyone. Like even in TLC, right? Before TLC, I only spoke with the people that were in my physical vicinity, or on a telephone or something, maybe. Like technology's allowed you to reach a little further, but even with TLC, I can only talk to so many people because hierarchy's bind and blind. That's PBK's hierarchy's bind and blind, right? It doesn't mean there's nothing valuable out there. It's just I can't interact with everyone. It's Dunbar number stuff.
Sorry, I'm going to stop after now and jump off. Let everyone else have time. But I guess I'm not saying that you're able to talk with anyone. I guess what I'm highlighting is that if there is already a limited amount of people you're able to communicate with Dunbar but and such, having the perspective of I'll only speak to people that are able to apprehend what I'm saying already narrows that number even further, sort of the point I'm making.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just limited because that's just a necessary limitation of not being infinite. But like, what does it mean to be infinite? Like, that doesn't even exist within a Trinitarian framework. Existence doesn't happen because infinitude and nothingness are synonymous within that frame. So like, it's just, I mean, that's it's not a problem because it's just the way it is, I think, from my vantage point. But anyhow, that's what Sherry says too. All right, Gavin. Who was first? Gavin. What's up, Gavin?
Hey, Luke. How are you?
Hey, buddy.
Good to be
I'm
here.
doing pretty well. I'm about over this cold, which I'm happy about.
Nice. You don't like the cold?
No, well, I don't like the upper respiratory infection that I had. No.
Yeah.
But I do like it in this sense because it makes me happy for when I'm normally just well,
Yeah. I got diagnosed with a hiatal hernia when I was like 20 years old. And so when I ate fast, when I was very hungry or nervous, I would all of a sudden need to run to the bathroom and like maybe throw up. Like it would just get stuck. And I told myself that it was there so that I would learn how to enjoy my food, how to relax. I used it as a teacher. Over decades later, I had children. I was reaching over to pull one out of the middle car seat, and it was giving me pain. And so I went to the GI doctor, over a decade later, and he did this endoscope, which I tried to do without the medicine while awake, have this thing stuffed down. And he got it down in there, like a sword eater kind of person, but he got it in there and I thought he was just going to peek and say, yeah, it's a hernia. But no, he took a picture and a sample and he took a picture and he said, okay, I'm going to start taking samples. And I'm like, all right, I'm calling it. Just put me under. But it ended up having a H. pylori bacteria. And I took a round of antibiotics and it disappeared. And it's like, that whole experience, I just say that because it's like, these things like a sickness or a cold come along. And is it your teacher? Is it, how much do you take it? How much do you fight it? Are you grateful for it? Or you try to cure it?
That's right. Everything's a gift if you receive it as a gift, man.
I threw in the idea just because I want to play a little devil's advocate. I said personalism is a paradigm to kind of throw it up against the idea that paradigmatic, the paradigmatic into the iconic. Right. So
yeah,
I might not be right, and then also I don't necessarily agree with it. I just wanted to throw it out there and poke.
No, that's cool. No, that's good because I think this is like the reality of the Tao. This is how it works in Christ and Antichrist. Is you could make personalism into a paradigm and into an icon, but the reality is when you're interacting with a person, if you're actually interacting with a person over time, long suffering, like with your wife, and you treat them like a paradigm, the relationship will collapse. So I would say in reality, as you're living out personalism, it's impossible to treat it as a paradigm because the relationship will break.
And what about like like you pray to Jesus and boom, you're a changed person. This kind of thing can happen. And so the people that knew you, they knew who you were and they don't know who you are now. And so the personalism gets in the way.
Well, but that would be the call for both you and them in that context of that relationship, to not insist on your own way. This is where even like the Christian, you know, you don't demand that they necessarily interact with you in the way that you have been transformed.
Is there a way of interacting with people in which you don't like grasp onto the past experience and interactions and relationship too much? Like I argue that that's a problem. So like this aspect of personalism that includes all of the past experiences can actually, it's like it will prevent like a divine, I don't know, Dialogos or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So. Well, I think that's true, but that's why it's so hard. That's why when I was talking about like that's why communication with my wife is actually so difficult, because, and this is how it's always worked for me, like people that are closer to me, it's why I'm the most critical and judgmental, which is something I need to work on for the people that are closest to me. Like the people that piss me off the most are the ortho bros, theologically. Like they drive me fucking crazy. And like when my family doesn't understand me, I'm like, you're my family. Like, what the hell? How long have I been with you and you still don't see, you know? But like, but I think, but even that, like that isn't a bug. That's like a feature. Well, into your own humility.
So what I've been noticing is my own perfectionism with my own standards, my wife's perfectionism and her standards. I'm hearing your perfectionism with your standards. Meanwhile, I also have a story of I want to cut down a tree so it doesn't land on someone's house, but the hurricane comes through, the tree lands on the house, the church comes in, meets a man whose wife had died months ago and is able to like love him, right? And so it's like our ideas of perfect are, like this is what's cool about Christianity is that all our ideas of perfect probably need to get into something like knowing and loving God and knowing and loving our neighbor, instead of, hey, how about we cut that tree down before the storm knocks it on the house, or whatever your idea of perfect is. So I'm just learning to try to be more careful with perfectionism.
No, for sure. But that's, I think what you're talking about with perfectionism is the paradigmatic mind. It's the thing that's stuck in this idea of whatever you think is perfect.
Yeah.
But Christianity is really, this is why it's henosis by kenosis. Your at one man is actually through yourself emptying and dying to that. Your idea of what's perfect.
I pass. Nice. Okay. Thank you.
Michael.
So a few things came to mind over all of this. I don't really know what order to put them in, so it might be a little rapid fire.
All right.
So it made me think of Peterson talking about the spirit of play, right? So you have the mice, and if one mouse, dominates the other too much, then they won't play, right?
Right.
So you have that problem. It's a cohesion thing, right? So if there is, or coercion thing, if there's too much coercion, right, then conversation's over, play's done. There's no conversation to be had if one's trying to dominate the other. So I thought of that. I thought about improv classes back when I used to do that when I was a kid. How there's this yes and play. In order to keep the play going, there's a yes and, right?
Yeah.
And there's something in that that's like a redemption of the good. Like you grab these pieces that are good and you highlight those and elevate them to the top in order to yes and continue the play. I also thought about Father Stephen DeYoung talking about how, from his perspective, Orthodoxy is a few hundred years out from having English adapted to it to be able to express it. And that goes along with what he says about the kind of Greek that's used, that was used at the time, that was used to write the New Testament, which was basically like a kind of Yiddish to German. Right, it's got its own kind of like unique quirks and things, right? So like if you were well versed in Homer and Plato, right, like a lot of it transfers over, but there's a lot of intentional adaptation of those words that has implications of more. Like obviously the way that they're using logos is very different, but also has ties. But further than that, that's I've been interested in digging into Gamaliel, and he talks about these different types of rivers, or these different type of fish. So there's a ritually impure fish, one who has memorized everything by study but has no understanding and is the son of poor parents. A ritually pure fish, one who has learnt and understood everything and is the son of rich parents. A fish from the river Jordan, one who has learned everything but doesn't know how to respond. A fish from the Mediterranean Sea, one who has learned everything and knows how to respond. I thought that was interesting. But personally, on I don't know, this journey or something, I found myself concerned with intelligibility, being able to build bridges. I mean, I've lived in a bunch of different worlds where there was a different language as a Pentecostal conservative growing up in Missouri. There's a different language as like a progressive Occupy leftist. There's a different language coming into Orthodox circles, right? There's like these different, there's a different language I had to use in the Marine Corps, right? And they're speaking about things very differently. And so being able to find ways to build bridges, still have intelligibility, but it not end up in domination and encourage a spirit of play. So I don't know. Those are things that came to mind for me.
Yeah. Well, my quick response to that would be the language piece is really interesting. The Gamaliel, how do you say his name? There's like two primary Jewish rabbis around the time, right? What's his name?
Gamaliel, I think.
Yeah. My tongue struggles with that one. And so that's fascinating, that whole thing. And then the Malcolm Guite thing that I referenced that Phlebas pointed to on that Tolkien thing that I put in the live chat, whatever. He was talking about that, which is something I've thought about so much. It's a huge McLuhan thing, and it's also tied into, like, I think Heidegger and Dasein and language, and how it's very connected to what you were saying and how much language forms you. And even English in the Orthodox liturgy is it's very Barfieldian, but like he was saying in that conversation, he spoke about Barfield so well that because he's talking about all these inklings, and it's really excellent. I almost recommend that conversation just as an ease into Barfield. And he says explicitly in there that Barfield is one of the harder inklings to get into because the philosophy is just so intensely complicated and hard. But he was saying, like, he was just pointing out how in Greek or Hebrew or whatever, and how much language forms your consciousness. And he used to use the simple illustration of wind, spirit, breath. And he said, really, like, it's almost impossible for an English speaking person to wrap your head around the idea that, and even translating the Bible, when it uses one of those words, it means all three simultaneously. It doesn't mean them separately. It really doesn't. And and you're just like, what? You can't even comprehend that as an English speaking person. And that's just a natural limitation of English. And I don't know, it's to me, but like that kind of thing is like, I don't hear something like that and I get bummed out by it. I'm just like, that's so fucking cool. That's exciting. Like, it means I have so much more to just like learn and expand. Like when I don't know something, it pumps me up. I get excited about it. Anyhow, that's my thing to that. C Money, what up, buddy?
Yo.
Hey.
Yeah, I was actually writing when I texted you and realized you were streaming, and I was talking a lot about this Barfieldian stuff actually, and so a lot of the stuff that you've been bringing up resonated with me, and then a lot of the stuff that each of the guys that have talked before me was resonating a lot. So I don't necessarily want to bring my own ideas into it and take over the stream, but there's so many different good ideas. I'm just here to play and see what you find relevant, and see if I can help rephrase something or push something forward. Because I think there's a lot of stimulating ideas out here, and I'm just kind of too overwhelmed to specify something right now.
No, that's cool. And we can, like, you and we got to set up a recorded convo sometime because we have a lot of things to play and talk about. So anyhow, Michael, brother, what up?
Well,
Your last video was really good, dude. Your last video, more than any other video I've seen of yours, is I was just like, now we're cooking. This is like my wavelength.
well, I mean, it's it's came from the sort of place of frustration, I guess. That with this paradigmatic mindset, we always tend to gravitate towards these different paradigms more naturally, and then that puts you in an antagonistic relationship with the opposite, whatever the opposite of that is. But the more you explore the variety of different paradigms, you begin to see that there is more connectedness and more overlap, and it makes life more complicated, but in a good way. It even just a little bit ago, somebody was pushing back on something that the JD Vance said on Twitter about that you're supposed to love your family and your countrymen, and then he had this sort of, I guess you could say, a priority of affections going from the closest to outward. And he didn't say you shouldn't love your enemies or that you shouldn't love foreigners, but that was the way that he had it. And this is a very conservative mindset. And people don't even understand that it's if you get mad because you hear him saying that because you think you're supposed to love your enemies, you just made him your enemy and you're not loving him. If you don't care about why he thinks that or feels that, you're not loving him, or you're not really making much of an effort to try to love him. It's it's just to be blinded by a political frame or whatever. Because that's the thing, because Christianity, it pushes back on all the other frames. We can't be aware of them all the time, and so in some ways that we're probably existing within a couple paradigms. So conservative and liberal, our Christian faith should be causing us to question some aspects of both of those things at any given time. But yeah, that was some of it.
All right. Well, I was listening. I didn't take a potty break. So my one of the things that came up is I agree about all the enemy stuff and pushing into it. But this is where Christianity isn't a paradigm. This is like what we've said. When Vervaeke says he wants to make a religion that's not a religion. And Nate Heil and I have always said Christianity is already that. Christianity isn't a paradigm because of the thing that I'm talking about, because it's person-centric. That's why the modernist, historicist Christian that wants to argue apologetics all day is in paradigmatic mode. That's not, you search the scriptures because in them you think you have life, but it's they who teach about me. You search the apologetics and the facts because you think you have life, and it's they that teach about me. And that Jesus now is manifest in your wife, in your child, in your neighbor, in the person you see on the street, in your enemy. And you have to actually act, not just hear the word, but be a doer of the word and love that person up to and including your own death. That's Christianity. That's not a paradigm.
So Luke, I have a similar thought to that, but I come at it from a different direction, or I think it's similar to where,
okay.
Right. So religio, to bind, right?
Yeah.
Right. So then I think about that. I think about the cults effectively as a synonym to that, right? Here's all these little cultures everywhere, right? And that in Christ is the end of religion, is the end of all cults, because it is the highest possible binding that contains the entire cosmos. Right?
Yeah, no, I think that's true. Yeah.
On my wedding day, my wife and I decided to tie ourselves together. So for the wedding reception afterwards, we were just tied together for hours, and it was interesting going to the bathroom. It was interesting. It was interesting, because I had been to a wedding before where the bride and the groom just separated for hours, and I said I didn't like that. I didn't want to do that. And so we got to talk with everyone together. But anyways, that's what came to mind about binding. Like, I like real examples. Like, what does it mean to bind? Like, what does it actually mean?
Mhm.
You know?
Well, so then, like, if there's, I, I don't know. There's a picture that I have in my mind of like, okay, should I don't know that I'm putting Christ on the throne, right? Maybe it's like me setting my eyes that he's already on the throne and I'm acknowledging it, right? And that's what creates an ordered reality. So when the Lord of Lords is over the top, sorry, here's all these other lords, here's all these other identities, here's all these other bindings, all these religios, but the only way that they can be correctly proportioned in their right place, how much of a husband I am, how much of a father I am, how much of a parishioner, a co-worker, a son, whatever, like all the different things, all the different identities, how much of a Republican I am, how much of an American I am, all of it. The only way it can be ordered in its correct proportion is in submission to the highest binding, which then will work through you to distribute those proportionally.
I don't, I hear what you're saying, but I almost wonder if like you can't have things like incorrect proportion. You're always going to be running into like these extremes where you should be loving everybody fully all the time. Like, but of course we are limited, and that recognition brings us to living in a constant state of repentance. But I'm just saying this in the pushback because I think it's very easy to think about like having like a balanced view of like how you're living as like an ideal, in that you have all the things in the correct proportion, but we're always actually finding the limits of our extreme inability to do any of it perfectly. And that's okay. That's okay if we're taking that moment to realize that's why we need Christ's presence in our lives to do it.
Right. And a quick response to that is like I've said forever that the devil will deceive you with balance just as much as he will with being extreme. And this is why it's like the rich young ruler. Not everybody's called to be the rich young ruler. You could take that paradigm of the rich young ruler and say everybody's called to give everything they have. But that's not true. That isn't true. You're absolutizing a particular, which is the opposite of personalism. Christ is infinitely particular in all the different particularities.
Mm-hmm.
I think I finally noticed a potential disconnect when you get talking about personalism, Luke. And I think that many people hear it as a form of partiality. And I think that one of the things we're kind of stumbling over is the problem of partiality with the whole friend-enemy distinction or the family-stranger distinction. And I want to bring in I was reading and listening last night to chapter 2 of Kierkegaard's Works of Love, which I haven't finished the book yet, but I've came up with a project that I wanted to do with the whole book. So I'm already starting that instead of finishing the book. But anyway, that's aside the point. He brings up this idea of partiality and the fact that because God is love and within God there is no partiality, that means that only Christian love is the thing that, and the Christian love meaning love of the neighbor, is the idea of like, it doesn't matter if you like hate your enemies and love your friends or love your polis or love the bindings that hold you to reality or any of that stuff, but it's wrong to call those Christian loves because the Christian love requires self-abnegation. And so the partiality has to fall away before it even can get started. And so I think that I don't know if that would be like a pushback towards the kind of point you were trying to make earlier in regards to it being harder to love people or to understand people closer to you. But in some sense, I guess I'm wondering, is love of neighbor the kind of white hot flame that is the most helpful to dwell upon, and all of this other stuff is kind of just, it shows in various ways how we are feeble and fail to love properly? Or is there something at work with what you were trying to say, which is that kind of neighborly love from a place of pure self-abnegation?
If I may
So,
try to steal man, Luke, even though I was the one that basically brought the critique of
holy
partiality
cow,
to
Tayo, you shape-shifting beauty, you.
hey man,
Ty as a goat.
I think, and I'll try to include what the two Michaels were saying, because I think there's a sense in which that where those other lords, so if Christ is the Lord of Lords, which I'm a Christian, praise God, he is, Christ is King, King of Kings, then the way in which we sort of the hierarchy of the smaller lords is a so it's never a static thing, as Michael Saitori was sort of pointing out. There's always a negotiation being made between, okay, how much attention or worship am I giving to this lowercase small lord, L lord, and personalism. Personalism I see as an attempt to sort of highlight the fact that it's not a static. The way those laws sort of fall into place, they're not static, nor is it one case for all thing. It's very dynamic in each person's life and from person to person. And trying to enforce your hierarchy of small lords on someone else is sort of this tyranny that I see Luke sort of pushing against. How did I do, Luke?
No, I think that was all good. I mean, I don't think I would disagree with any of that. Like the thing I would say to McMo, and this is I'm gonna drop a bomb in here again, but this is the way I do it. So like I think in a sense of what OG was saying and what I was saying earlier is true, is that in a lot of ways, because like you think about a couple that gets divorced or something that goes wrong or whatever, the person that you love the most turns into the person that, and a lot of times you hate the most. And so like that love and that hate, so like the understanding and the communication has fallen apart to such a degree that like your most intense love has turned into your most intense hate. And so that's why I think that sometimes the people that are closest to you, if you're not truly self-emptying, can turn into that, or it can just turn into like a quiet resentment where you don't, I mean, that happens too, but then that's a form of hatred. It's just a form of really intense passive hatred that can dissolve the relationship too. But so that's where inside the relationship it's hard. And I understand what McMo was saying about the loving of other people that are outside. That's very difficult. I think that's true in Christianity, like the neighbor or the Good Samaritan or Christ, or, you know, I mean, there's all of that stuff. Dying for your enemies is central to Christianity, but it's like and I think that's essential. I don't think Sherry said that at some point up here. She said like everyone's going to have to give everything at some, like eventually, but that's part of death. I mean, we're all going to die. You're all going to give up everything at some point. All of us are. That's just the nature of the beast. And I think for a Christian, here's the bomb. This is for my Christian universalism, is that I'm not saved as long as anyone exists in hell. As long as anyone exists in hell, I'm there because I love my enemies. No one can exist in hell without me being there. So I'm not in heaven with other people in hell. That's not salvation.
So Sherry did bring up a quote to me that came up a lot when I was in like leadership training in the Marine Corps, right? Which is familiarity breeds contempt. I've thought a lot about that.
That's the same thing, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but I struggle to, like only within the paradigm of like egocentric versus egocentric, like that's gonna happen for sure, no question. Right. And so they'd be like, okay, well, if you're a manager, like don't get too familiar with those that you manage, kind of thing. But I don't know. I mean, I guess the other thing that came to mind, Luke, was and maybe this is just like a little bit of a language difference thing, but instead of just strictly like self-emptying and killing the ego, I find myself thinking a lot about like a transfigured ego, right? Like,
yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah. And so it's because there was a time where I really was just like emptying, right? Like almost in a Buddhist sense or something,
sure.
Right? And so it's just like empty, collapse the house, instead of a transfigured ego that gets built on the rock or something like that.
Right, but that's a very Christian idea too. Your ego,
Mm.
you go into ego death, and then your ego is resurrected in a
Mhm.
way that isn't just like a complete passive pushover whatever you want, because that's not, then you have such a ego death that you don't even exist and the other person exists, but that's not Christianity. Christianity is both and living as
Yeah.
one, distinction as one.
So I watched this play out with my mom, right? Using very heavy Pentecostal evangelical language that's very different from how I think about things, and sometimes, you know, I might be willing to say too many combative things. Not exactly combative, but they're things that can tempt provocation, right? The things that like even just like talking about Father Stephen D. Young's work and like what Pharisees are or something, it can like lead to a total meltdown, right? And in order to be able to navigate that, right, there has to be like a love for her that is higher than my desire to espouse some kind of information, something, right? I gotta
Yeah.
love her enough, but that doesn't mean not to inject some helpful truth or loving ideas in there that might like lift her up. But if the lifting up becomes like tyrannical, then I notice it collapses and it gets adversarial.
If you say the last part again, if lifting her up becomes tyrannical.
Yeah. So let's say like I'm like, oh well, you know, if I can communicate, you know, these ideas enough, right, then it can kind of shift the paradigm. Yeah. And so then if I
That's
push
where I
on
get
it
stuck
too
all the time.
much and I poke on it too much, then all of a sudden I think that there's no more play because I've become coercive in it. It's no longer a banter. I'm just pushing information down.
Yeah. Tell me if this is the same thing. I was talking in my conversation with McMo yesterday, I was talking about that, of how I can, like in my relationship with people close to me or my wife, I have this weird, it's this Christ and Antichrist flip, where I have this weird Christian idea of pietism and self-emptying, where I try to not insist on my own way, but I do it. I'm doing it mechanically before I'm actually ready to do it. And so what happens is, like, I'm trying to do it because I have this paradigmatic idea of what I need to be doing, but the reality is I'm not really there yet. And so then what happens is one of my chief sins I struggle with is resentment. You know, quoting Maddie Diaz again, she has a song called Resentment, which I love, and she says, like, I don't hate you, babe, it's worse than that, because you hurt me and I don't react. I've been building this thing up for months. Oh, resentment. You know, it's just like, holy shit, that's me. Like, you hurt me and I don't react. You know, because what happens is, like, you're supposed to truly give up, where it's just like, okay, like, my ego is aligned with this self-emptying, and what I really want in my true self is to give up for you, but that requires discernment and real integration. But the reality is if you're not there, that's going to go into the shadow, man. You're going to get resentful and it's going to come out sideways. It doesn't work.
So the improv class yes and thing, right?
Uh-huh.
I find that when that resentment is creeping in, because I've got a huge baggage of temptation of wanting to like resent my parents and where I came from and all these things, right? But the antidote, as far as I can tell, is like participating in gratitude, which is also the yes and. It's like redeeming these good things. Here's so my mom will say all this stuff. Okay, this is good, this is good, this is good. Lift those up, appreciate those, further dialogue on those, and then instead of me being irritated about something, I've you know, some kind of a destructive theological idea that I've judged it as so, right? Instead of that, then we get to play together in what is good. And I don't know, something like that.
Yeah. Okay, admin thing. I want other people to talk because I'm going to leave in about 10 minutes. So everybody else talk. Tayo could take over if he wants to. Just putting that out there.
I was going to mention success stories versus like failure stories in doing this. And yeah, it's I don't know, the number of success stories in my entire life has been very small, but I'm starting to get more successes under my belt. But yeah, like Michael talking about interactions with his mom, it's like I've been there in all of my relationships throughout my entire life, just dumping criticisms and truth without even feeling bad about it, but then people becoming defensive,
Right.
and just very good at making people not want to be around me, you know.
Truth bombs. We used to, in my old evangelical church, we used to call that truth bombing people. You know, it's like when someone's suffering and you just quote Romans 8:28 at them, you know, all things work for the good of those who are called according to his purpose, you know. Just like, I know this is hard, but like, listen, it'll be great. This slight momentary affliction is preparing for all an eternal weight of glory beyond all comprehension.
No.
And they're just like, fuck you.
Well, so what I got surprised. I ended up using this phrase as saying, you're telling yourself a lie, right? That's what this phrase ended up using. And then it surprised, because I've had truth backfire on me so much throughout my life. I was very surprised whenever, you know, my wife's like, I'm so glad you told me that was a lie, because the truth, like there's something, you know, I've always been skeptical of people who say, oh, it's the devil, it's Satan, he's a liar, telling you lies.
Yeah.
But the thing is like, we really do end up, like, we are susceptible to believing lies. And
Sure,
man, if there's some things we don't even want to believe it, but we believe it. And just having someone come and say, that's a lie. Like, you're a good mom. Stop telling yourself you're a terrible mom, you know, whatever it is. So I don't know. That's something, that's a phrase I've been able to utter with good results, is to be able to spot the lie.
I just thought of something. See, money, where are you at, brother? I mean, I can just trust you to jump in when you want, but I'm calling you out.
Sure. The familiarity breeds contempt. There's something about meaning in life that like home is where you make it, and meaning is where you find it, or meaning is where you believe in it. And there's something about being a homo sapien where we find meaning in our sapiential frameworks, and therefore we abstract ideas or familiar patterns or labels or like categories. We categorize people, we categorize events, we categorize ourselves, and then we become very familiar with this meaningful pattern that we have imposed on that phenomenon. And then we begin to relate to the abstracted out meaningful pattern of the phenomenon. And to the extent that we are believing in that idea is somewhat the extent we are no longer in tension or attending to or realizing the phenomenal relations in front of us. And so there's something about the original sin of being a man that is a man motivated by an abstract idea. And there's something inherent about an abstract idea that isn't living. And so there's something inherent about acting like you know something abstract that ultimately is an anti-life philosophy and will lead to your death. There's something in that sort of metaphorical implication where the more you think you know something, the more you've abstracted out the essence, the more you've kind of created a propositional tyranny, and you've actually sealed yourself off from the godly creation of an ongoing relation of recognition. And so we sort of identify ourselves in certain ways, and then we expect the world to reflect the image of our abstraction. And then when the territory is different than the map, we tend to reject the territory and double down on the map. And so like Michael was saying something about the improv yes and, that's how your relationship should be with reality. You should be like, I have a map that disagrees with me, but that's reality, and I will reorient towards reality. And there's something Luciferian and arrogant about the modern condition to think you know things, that assumes the sapiential framework as a sense of separation that says, no, my idea and expectation of what I think is familiar is what I demand to see. And this actual person with complex differences doesn't fit my mind. Therefore, I'm going to reject reality and double down on my framework, or I'm going to try to beat that real person to submit to my idea of them, in which case it's like what you were saying, you're trying to put them up on a pedestal. Like you're saying, I've defined you as such, and therefore I need to treat you as such. And then that's no longer a open, responding, interacting relation of development or a living, godly relation. It's a separate, I know, knowledge, narcissistic, ignorant, Luciferian propositional tyranny.
Absolutely,
I
brother.
came back on because I wanted to play with C Money. Oh, sorry, Luke, you're showing something.
Well, just what he was saying just made me think of this. This is like my proper knowledge life verse. You know, this isn't the text, this isn't the version I know, but like, knowledge inflates with pride, but love builds up. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies, builds up. If anyone thinks he knows anything he does not yet know, as he ought to know it. But if anyone loves God, he is known by him. That's kenotic relational epistemology. It's falling out of the paradigmatic mind. This doesn't mean you don't have opinions. This is what I say all the time. It doesn't mean you don't have propositions. It doesn't mean you don't have that stuff, but they're not closed Luciferian Ouroboros loops.
Luke, do you think that the highest form of that edification?
Let's let Tayo talk. Sorry, buddy.
Sorry, Micah. I came on because I wanted to play with C Money, and I was listening very carefully enough to try to follow what he was saying, and I think I sort of followed it to an extent. The map and the territory narrative, I think, helped me to grab onto what you were presenting. But I think there was a little slip of a straw man in there, in as much as I don't think it's ever a process of choosing to believe the map and ignore the territory. It's much more finding a territory that sort of matches the map that I'm not willing to let go of, and choosing to engage with that reality as the only reality that exists. Are you tracking what I'm putting down?
Almost.
So,
maybe can you rephrase it just a little bit? But I think so. I think it's close.
So, for example, it's a night out, and a girl looked at me in a way where I thought, oh, she's got a thing for me, and that's the map I've got in my brain. And I go to her and try to speak to her, and she said, oh, sorry, I'm just going to the toilet. Now, there's a sense in which I could interpret that reality that just confronted me as opposite to the map that I've got. Or I can say, no, she's going to the bridge, she's going when she comes back. Or even tell myself, oh, she wants to go make herself more beautiful so that she can be more presentable to me. So the territory, it doesn't really dispose the map if I don't want to engage as such.
Yeah, so there's something about the temptation to overfit to data that I think is inherently implied in the way that the question is structured. It seems as though we're abstracting out a procedure and then saying, how do we typify this procedure in such a way that we can act procedurally in order to do this for us? And I think the actual answer lies somewhere in the ability of the person to be present and to discern. There's something about the unconscious signals. There's something about the non-literal things. There's something about the non-specific that's going on. That's sort of like a wave or a frequency in which your present spirit can kind of interpret. So is the girl actually going to the bathroom, or is she just giving you some bullshit line? Like, just if your consciousness is only directed towards the specific communication, you don't know how to interpret the data. And so there's something about being present in interaction where those subtle data interpretations are actually either beneath or above the layer of consciousness. And so if we are to post hoc rationalize this, I can't say this is how you should treat it on a conscious level. Because in theory, I think you don't want to be consciousness first. I don't think you want a plan to interact with the scenario. And sorry if that's a straw man evasion, but that was my first pedantic thing was to kind of undermine the substrate of that. I don't know if that's helpful or if that's is that...
No, I think that's fair, and I do take your point, but I think even with that being considered, at some point you're going to have to make a leap of faith, to bring back in Kierkegaard, because you're going to have to interpret the information that that the territory is presenting, and there's going to be pre-conscious programming that you're using to come to the conclusion that you come to given the information presented to you. And I think it's not either or. At either whichever leap you make, the map and the territory are always involved. Is sort of the point I'm making.
Yes, they're always involved and they're always contradictory. So you can never follow one or the other. You can never say this is the right way because it says so, or this is the right way because it appears that way. There's always a difference between the appearance and the reality, and there's always a difference between the memory and the present, and there's always a difference between the implications of the past and the projections towards the future. Like reality is just not objective and clear cut. And so it's like actually really hard to talk about this stuff objectively and specifically.
I think you can ask yourself what has gotten inside me, and you can get good at recognizing if you have resentment or if you have, love, unconditional love. Like, I like that approach. I can lean on that.
Sure.
See, so what you're described largely strikes me as a lot of the themes that Ian McGillicrest is getting at, and I always wonder if when I'm talking to folks, I notice that if there's if there's a story, right, or a parable or something that evokes imagery that gets many streams moving at once rather than operating on a left hemispheric frame only, right, which is like a drawing. Like the highest form of communication is not Paul in his epistles, but Jesus' parables.
Sorry, I didn't know how to respond to that. Sorry, I thought you were just setting the stage. Where can I go from there? Sorry. Can you give me one more space?
So I don't know. I guess it's mostly an agreement, but it's. I guess personally, I think about that a lot because I go, gosh, how do I transform this stuff into story, into parable? And maybe it's just because of a focus problem. I don't set my eyes enough on stories, on parable, on poetry. I put my eyes and my ears too much on philosophical, left hemispheric frameworks.
Okay, let's take a maps of meaning approach to this. Let's take Peterson, because maps of meaning, the matter with things, and the master and his emissary are foundational in a lot of what I'm talking about here. And so there's something about the meaning of the map that signifies action towards us, or there's something about the structure of that pattern that has an adaptive living capacity to it. And so we always have to be oriented towards concepts that have embodied meaning. And so it gets really tough when you abstract something out to something literal, because that's literally not embodied. It's like so the McGilchrist's two hemispheres are almost like two different characters. They're almost like two different ways of interpreting. And so every person is almost like bipolar or having two different spirits. And so I'm projecting a lot of my own bullshit onto this, but it's kind of like your right hemisphere is Christ and your left hemisphere is Satan. Your left hemisphere deals with the structures that are already known. They're set and setting. They are separated and determined and spelled out and static and like recognized, and you already know them. And then your right hemisphere like kind of opens up and doesn't know and submits and stands under and gives off like a humble vibe. And so we're always kind of contrasting between humble insufficiency and unknowing, and then also arrogant knowledge and oriented. And so humans are like goal-directed agents, and so we always have these sapiential frameworks that orient our goals. But fundamentally, our sapiential frameworks are always based on an underlying embodied substrate. And so there's always this polarity of like a strange loop of interaction. And so there's no such thing as like what's Gödel's incompleteness theorem or the Gödel-Escher-Bach. There's no delineation between cause and effect. But as humans, in order to talk, in order to signify, we arbitrarily construct cause and effect. And so the ultimate point of talking is to have a narrative embodied applicatory effect. And so the ultimate meaning stories are world stories that give you a valence for action. It gives you a disposition to relate to your environment in such a way that makes you receptive enough to be adaptive. And so we always talk about meaning stories and what is our identity and who we are and what we do and what we believe in. And then that sort of sets the stage for how we interpret the world. And then how we interpret the world sets the stage for how we emotionally respond to the map versus the territory. And so there's something about stories that are inherently metaphorical and relational. And you go on a journey or a quest. And that's a living, changing, spiritually adapting process, rather than like a computer that like downloads program number 413. And then when I get into a real problem, well, I just plug in 413 and it's all for me. And so there's something about this modern temptation to be programmed by a literal idea that actually removes us from participation and then atrophies our spirit. And so you mentioned something about different fish or something, and that reminds me of a Native American story about the two wolves inside of your mind. One is greedy and vengeful and powerful, and the other one is loving and communal. And the child asks the grandfather which one wins, and he says it's whichever one you feed. And so then in the McGill-Christian sense, which hemisphere are you paying attention to? Which hemisphere are you feeding? Which wolf, which half of your bipolar spirit are you channeling to engage this present moment? And a lot of times we engage the setting, the structure, what we already know, what we learned in 4th grade. We just go with the structure that's already known. And in some sense, that's very effective and very productive. But in another sense, that's fake, it's dehuman, it's not real, it's not creative, it's not ongoing, it's not adaptive, it's not future oriented. And so it's not transcendent. It then becomes decadent because it's aimed at the past, it's aimed at the structure. And so there's something about stories and narrative and parables that is provocative within the listener, but doesn't make any sense objectively. It's not, the point is not to objectively tell you what is the fact. The point is to engage your mind and to bounce things off and to reorient yourself in such a way that you have the proper relationary, humble spirit to adapt to whatever the problem is in front of you. And that's almost never what you assumed it was when you stepped into it. And so you need to have an assumption, but then you also need to be open to the reality. And in the contrast of assumption and reality undermines an objective linguistic metaphorical substrate. Therefore, a narrative metaphorical substrate or a symbolic or iconic or something like that that revivifies and embodies it, that's kind of the only way to talk about reality if you want to get philosophical or abstract or whatever.
There's a sense of it. Michael, I'll let you respond first.
Well,
okay.
Go for it, Tail.
No, sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, I got a lot of what you're saying. Part of this is pretty easy for me to grasp, as this is the consequence of understanding autism, which I didn't know for a long time, but I knew I had a thing where there's a ability that other people seem to have where they can just be on the same wavelength, and I don't have it. So then I have to think about, okay, like if it was a date or something like that, think back over the night. What did she say? What this happened? Where, what were the signs? And then try to figure it out. And then, but because of that, because I was missing that element of the sort of implicit understanding or whatever, that the thing that autistic people don't have. Yeah. I had to choose what kind of a narrative I was going to structure on that. And growing up in the Christian faith, I basically decided I'm going to always give everybody the benefit of the doubt, even though I know sometimes that means I'm going to be hurt, because if I instead always am suspicious of everybody, that's just going to put me in a spiral of despair. And that's something that I think a lot of people get into, because you just always want to assume the worst of every interaction. And that's so basically depending on which map you use, it will affect a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So I want to get back into the McGill-Christ and the two different spirits, and then the Native American, which one wins, the one you feed. And then if we think about
Simon, before you go further into that, let me just do some clarification on the two-spirit thing, particularly.
Sure. Yeah.
Because that's also paint a narrative of the brain as disjointed. And
Yes.
I
Yes.
don't, I think the left hemisphere, right hemisphere distinction is the left hemisphere and right hemisphere of the brain. There is already a unifying, that they're not divided in their function, they're unified in their biological embodied reality. So the narrative of two spirits already to me paints a picture of one or the other, feed this one and
Okay,
not that
so
one.
can we just reorient towards a yin yang then? The yin yang being the one thing we're talking about, and then the two spirits being like the two colors. And so when we're talking about one thing, we're actually talking about half of it. And when we're talking about half of it, it's an interdependent half. So by implication, we're also referring to the other side. So unfortunately, this arbitrary distinction of two hemispheres creates this confusing pattern. And so I think I get your objection, but I think the nature of the interpretation, you have to realize that we are arbitrarily making distinctions, and that's just a slippery slope of language or something like that. Does that make any sense? Is that helpful at all?
I'll let you land, but I'm not convinced on that
Okay.
solving critique I was offering, but I
Yeah,
think that was too far.
so that's a lot of the Gilchristian theory, is that unfortunately, while writing a book, you have to explain something. And so when he was trying to explain the sacred, he felt sacrilegious because he was quantifying that which can't be quantified. And so when we talk in language like this, we have to quantify it out, and then we bastardize it out, and then we misrepresent it. And so there's something about the either or and both and that uses both the ways we framework, but then also the way we interpret and the way we apply or the way we perceive or something like that. There's an engagement, there's an experiencing of that. And there's something about the experiencing of the map that's just like kind of implied when we talk about maps. But when we talk about maps, we have to ignore the implication. And so it's shit. I don't know. Does that help? Is that landing at all?
So I have a weird take on this, and let me know what you think of it. So so the deepest me, in some sense, is like an eye, right? And like, what am I looking at? I take that, and then I go, okay, well, the eye aims, right? And I'm convinced that there is one light in the darkness. Everything else is darkness. So how does that end up existing? So then, like, okay, there are, it's like there's tree of knowledge of good and bad, and then there is tree of life, right? And so should I set my eyes anywhere but on the light that is the tree of life, I'm going to almost like build with that wood from that tree. And if I'm building with the wood of the tree from the knowledge of good and bad, then it's going to be a house on sand. It's always going to be a house on sand, and inevitably it's going to collapse in one way or another. But only if I have my eyes on the light of the tree of life can I build a house on the rock. And that's effectively like a transfigured ego, but there's also an inherent danger of lying to yourself about whether that's happening.
Definitely, absolutely. And so that's the thing is, if you build your personality on rigid conceptualizations of the self, then when your actual complex present moment requires flexibility, then your structure breaks down and you fail. And so there's something about civilization that structures ourselves so much that we kind of now assume we're supposed to structure our way through everything. And so, like Sartori was talking about, we need to structure for this, and we need to structure for that, and we need to structure for this, and we need to structure for that. And at some sense, that misses the bigger point. And at some sense, that's a problem. But then the other sense, what I'm trying to get at is the McGilchrist theory is that our culture has this characteristic. And so given we are fruits of this culture, we are also going to have this characteristic. And so I'm sitting there demonizing it while admitting it in myself and while talking about it with Sartori. Like, I agree with you. I think our culture is getting autistic. I think we do need to have things separated out and spelled out. I don't think we are able to resonate on a communal spirit of co-orientation. I think we assume we are separate, and we assume we need to be told how to program our separate attention. And I think there is something about that is breaking down the community. And I think that's what this whole conversation is in response to, is something like that. And so, yeah, I really identified with what you were saying, the like, oh, well, I need everything to be broken down so I know what to do. But to me, that's actually the same like spirit that thinks it needs a process to know what it's doing. It's not the able to be present and let the Spirit of Christ interact with that which has not yet been determined. And so there's something about being present with potential in co-creating that which is not yet determined that's like, I don't know, hemispherically different or spiritually different, or it's a different orientation from what is the issue, how do I program myself way through it, what am I familiar with, what am I expecting, and how do I use my words to get what I think I already know out of this.
So I think those different programs that can be mapped onto the left hemisphere is effectively what's being communicated on as taking on a yoke.
Something like that. You are vibing along with the spirit of interpretation. And so in a way of like feeding the left, the wolf, or the voting for the fish or whatever, you are building your personality to be valent, to find value, to find meaning, to find salience in frameworks. And it's like the essence of your frameworks of how you shape personalities is kind of your character. That's what it means to be Adam, or to be a man, or to have an atomic center of gravity, is to build your personality in a way that has meaning and significance, and you can direct energy and be a goal-directed leader, shepherd, shepherd, sorry. Yeah, a lot of metaphors here to mix. But does that make sense?
Yeah, I think the thing that kept coming to my mind as the example would be, well, okay, so at least at the secondary level, we all can credit our existence to our parents' sexual union, and so that, that's just like a fact or whatever. But then like the stories we tell about that is really going to have a profound impact on our identity. And some people can't, when you think about your own identity, it's like not everybody has control over that. Some people are born out of a unfortunate circumstance, but you can then see like, oh, okay, well, if you have this narrative that this is just the biological drives that brings people together and that's all there is to it, that's going to be a more limiting formation for the formation of personality than like the marriage story, which is to say, like, the reason why you'd have a wedding ceremony is it's involving the community and in validating that act which creates life in like the best frame, because everybody's present, everybody knows what's if you have a marriage with no sex, it's not really a marriage. Like that's the point of it. But the point of the whole like ceremony thing is that it gives everybody the understanding, like these are the people that are supposed to be together. And that separates them in a relation from everybody else in the community, and it allows their kids to like know that they had a purpose and all that.
Yeah, I think what you're doing is you're trying to establish a pattern of meaningful relation. And so you label your wife as a certain thing, you label your relationships as a certain way, you label yourself in the community as a certain way. And then given that common background of understanding of what you are and what you mean, well, then the community knows how to relate to you. And so, if you are married, then women aren't going to try to flirt with you, or you are, a blacksmith, people are not going to come to you for dentistry. Like you have these identities, and then people know how to relate to you. And there's something about creating order and having proper identities that is both sapiential and embodied, and is both individual and community. And so as a communion, you need to be shifting your individual identity and your communal identity, as well as your embodied identity and your conceptual identity. And it's through the interplaying of all of these and the co-establishment of the spirit behind that you become co-inspired, and you share a community, and you become unified, and life is meaningful and more ordered. And then life is more heavenly and less chaotic, something like that. And so there's something about aiming yourself and getting the community to agree with your aim that then makes life more ordered and is more heavenly, or something like that. It's more enjoyable. Is that fair to rephrase you?
Yeah. And I think we just are now kind of in a phase where we used to have really good systems, but people didn't really understand why they were good because they just inherited it, and then they broke them. And now we've seen how the breaking of a lot of those traditions was really bad. And so now people are readopting them. But I am optimistic in a sense that now people understand more why those patterns were preferential and all that. So that's I think there's some hope for the future in that regard. That's kind of that thing of moving from sincerity to authenticity to pro-felicity, which can be really fake because you can create your identity, but that ability to create your identity is only destructive if you're creating something that kind of goes against the grain
It's a
of
pretense.
reality.
If you're saying that I identify as this concept, and then your body doesn't back that up, well, then you're using your Luciferian intellect to deceive, to misrepresent yourself. And then you're getting credit for something that you're not. And so that, I think, is another huge thing in our modern society, is we just spit out public facades. Oh, hey, how you doing, man? Oh, I'm living the dream. How are you? And so we set out all of these expectations. And then if we don't embody them, that creates a spiritual malaise. And then the less integrity you have with your words, well, the weaker your moral compass is. Something to that effect. The more you've sold your soul to a lie, you've deceived yourself. You've corrupted your own meaning-making software, so to speak. And so you did it yourself in a certain way. But like I said before, this is the culture we grow up in. And so these are the familiar patterns we learn are normative. And so we grow up normalizing these patterns of sin and original sin and enculturation, and we're all fucked. But at the same time, it's our burden to realize this and to pay attention and to move forward. And so given that we have been grown into this original sin of presuming our cognitive frameworks are superior, how do we re-embody and shift our spirit towards a more open, adaptive framework? I think if we just let the paradigm of the boomers go, we're not going to, I don't think that works. So I think we need a change of mind. We need a change of spirit. We need a tipping point of a spiritual transformation where we feed the right hemispheric wolf of compassion and non-rivalrous dynamics. How do we do that is given the paradigm, given what we think is reasonable, how do we do something totally different? Well, we have to abandon what's reasonable. And so we have to come off it. We have to be humble. We have to admit that our previous paradigm is potentially impotent. And then we can identify with the creative Christ that can come up with a solution to survive, something like that. Give or take.
So, were you going to say something? Yeah.
Yeah, I was. Also, I'm going to keep this going for about 30 more minutes. And unless someone else comes to keep it going, I'll probably have to shut it down. But just slowing things down a little bit, because the narrative as it currently stands is the West has been captured by the spirit of the left brain.
Basically,
and therefore not been had opportunity to the blessings that the right brain affords. Correct. And now we're looking for a psychotechnology that will help us transition that, make that movement. And I think Luke is proposing that the advent of podcasts and conversations and non-written word basically is meant to aid in this transition of sorts. I think, if I understand what you're saying correctly.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's something about a literal text that is published and passed down that temptingly opens itself up to objective thinking. And there's something about your grandfather sitting around the fire and imagining a world of spirits in danger that's actually like way more real and vivifying. And so there's something about the people who communicate a message that embody a spirit of meaning, and that has a valence, that has an emotion. There's an energy and motion and a communication based on the spirit of interpretation that revivifies something. And then there's something about something printed that just sits on a shelf and doesn't change unless somebody else changes it. That's kind of dead. And so we've kind of based our culture around something collapsed and dead. And then we just assume if we robotically parrot the part of propaganda that everything will work out fine. But I think that has kind of run its course a little bit. But I don't know. I'm just here. I'm here. Yeah.
Well, that's funny because that's why the story of the Tower of Babel I think is so interesting, because you can't think of it as like punishment or whatever. It's more like discipline, because God saw those people couldn't break out of their paradigm while they were all speaking the same language. But then by scattering them, because then you see, like, we can see like in the way that these cultures around the Mediterranean and things, how there was this history of them interacting over time, and they all knew they were missing pieces of the picture, and they were sharing their knowledge, and then it like comes together. But then you'd also if it's the real meaning, it has to be able to get across in translation. Like, yes. I know Michael has really achieved a good place in his relationship with Christ in Orthodoxy, because he can translate it back into Pentecostalism to talk to his mom about it. Like, I'm very suspicious when somebody only can use like the official terminology and the new words, and they can't explain it in any other way. But when
because they're just regurgitating the literal pattern of the text. They're not intuiting the spirit and then being able to reframe that spirit in a different particular context. And so that's the aim of spiritual intent. That's like the level of analysis you're taking. And so what I think has happened is we've left hemispherically zoomed into a level of analysis that specifies. And that blinds us from the other levels of analysis that also contribute to the meaning. So we've confused ourselves by pretending all of the meaning is here. And then we are blind to all the unconscious godly intuitions that are beyond our egoic scope. And so we try to use our ego to plan everything. And that just really misses the point. And like, there's this weird paradox. The more we specify information, the more we disembody it. And so the more it becomes real and clear, the less it becomes livable and intuitable. And so there's always a give and take paradox. And so it's really tempting to say, hey, I found this framework orienting, therefore I'm going to conform to this orientation. And then you kind of lose yourself in the process.
So
it's a tough line to walk.
This is sort of where this conversation sort of fractally collapses into the institutions conversation, because it's the usefulness that you do get from the narrowing that you do. There's a utility, that there's a function that it has where it can, and also not just for yourself but for others, which the teachability of it becomes the time taken for you to acquire the knowledge gets shortened by tightening the specificity of what knowledge is needed and which one can be discarded.
It's narrowing down your aim. It's improving your aim. Yeah.
So
it talks a lot about that which is most adaptive is also that which is most potentially self-deceptive and self-destructive. And I think that's what the intellect is. I think that Luciferian ego should be the highest angel at the right hand of God, but it should never be God. Like, it's the most useful tool in our shed. But if we only look at the world through that one tool, then we're fools. We're tools. Like, so there's something about, I don't know.
So let me see what you think about this. So let's say that this ego thing is something that can be, written and rewritten, right? It's almost like a memory on a computer.
I think that's the Christ is that which lets one ego die so a new ego comes. And so I think ideally you're supposed to be a person with 10 million egos in your life. Yes.
So then there's like the eye. The eye can direct towards things. Now, once you like jump over from there's a yoke that we've taken on, right? And that is effectively like gods with certain characteristics. In the West, you could point to liberty as a type of God. You could point at rationalism as a type of God. We've taken on those, and we've really tried to fortify this house on sand.
We've idolized hyperobjects, so to speak. Yeah.
And then you can break from that into an enchantment, quote unquote, right? To where more fluidly these other gods, these other Elohim, right, that are floating around inter between us and within your right hemisphere, those yokes can be taken on. You could fortify other yokes. You could fortify other gods. You could go full Dionysian and really lock that in, and it's about, eating well and drinking well and good sex and all these things, right? You could lock any of those into your ego. You could take any one of those yokes on, but every single one of them is under the law of death, is a dead end, except for one that stands above all, right, that can properly bring in any of the proportionality of those yokes. And
so it isn't the nature of the yokes themselves, it's the spirit of that which uses the yokes as tools to manifest the unconscious patterns that are inspiring up from within.
Right, which is like the Nietzschean will to power problem. Like, as soon as you think that you can direct the correct proportion of that to bring in, the Dionysianness doesn't. You don't have it; it has you.
Between a self center of gravity and an ego center of gravity, we often get confused with our little egos, and we confuse that for the self. And I was struggling when you said the I, because I didn't know how you meant I, because our identities are so multivalent like that, and so. The linguistic structure that we use to talk about is like I as in one person. But once you really get down into the cognition and the brain chemistry, like the I is not one person. Once you get into the philosophy of Eastern whatever, like the I is not one person. So any sentence that presupposes that in the question kind of frames the problem into an unanswerable way.
Well, it's funny you said that, because when I was saying I was meaning more like I.
The perceptive fact, the rational faculty, the
deepest me is the I that looks.
Okay. And so that the nature of that, I think, is multifaceted. And I think we often get confused because we misrepresent the significance of that I into I don't know. Hyperobjects, egregore. Words break down here. I really don't know how to map this. But I think that's actually the problem. I think that's the kind of the Barfieldian point, is that the language that is like basically within the Overton window of accepted normative conversation is so simple that it doesn't actually capture the true depths of the cognitive phenomena that is the experience of our lives. And so if we're going to accurately speak about our experience, well, we have to make up language or something like that. Like there's no Like we have to be imaginal. We have to be insane. We have to go outside of the normative structures in order for this stuff to even make any sense. That's why it needs to be a metaphor. That's why it needs to be symbolic. That's why it needs to be mystical or religious, or to relate to that which is beyond what's known. Because what's known
it is present. It is present in Romans chapter 7 when Paul talks about, it's not I, but the sin that lives within me. Like he's talking about this wrestling between identities, and essentially without the presence of the third one, which is Christ,
it's not the spirit.
The one always wins over the other.
It's not the spirit producing my manifestations. It is the ways in which I have structured my personality like a prism, so that when I project my energy out, it becomes colored in the shape of those ideas that I've agreed to. And the way that we misidentify those pyramidal shapes of our personality alters the way that we express ourselves and the colors and the emotions of our things. In the ways that our mental maps are confused or mistaken, then fundamentally misguides our intuition of the problem. And then with a misguided intuition of the problem, we misaim a solution. And to the degree that we misidentify problems and misaim solutions is the degree we miss a mark, or we live a life full of sin. And so there's something about goodness or psychotherapy or Christianity or being a preacher or going through this TLC process that's about improving the ways, the prisms in which we project our understanding of the world, such that they're not so tainted and so broken and so low resolution and so too simple to deal with the complexity of the presence. And so there's something about breaking down those old childish frameworks and thinking like a new, more complicated adult that is kind of identifying with the spirit that transitions between egos and is therefore willing to let each ego die. And so it's not the presumptuous ego that knows, it's that which can let its ego die and be recreated and die and be recreated and die and be created. And then 20 years later is like a mature, loving adult. And so I think our temptation is to want to win now. And if we want to win now, we need to know what the game is that we're playing. And if we know what the game it is we're playing and we need to win now, then we're going to use our language to manipulate to win now. And then we're selling our soul to mammon. And then we're cursing our 40-year-old self to be a fool. And so there's something about suffering the consequence in the moment that reorients your personality, that makes you wiser, that then makes you less sinfully interpreting the world, which then makes you less sinfully acting in the world, which makes your life and the life of your loved ones better. And so I think that's kind of the initial goal, or the eventual goal of what we're all circling around here. But
so say that the eye of my heart. So I'm talking to my mom, right? And the eye of my heart is searching to aim and hit the mark, right? Mm-hmm. But there's a testing of the spirits that has to happen continuously as that's going on, where I'm going, okay, is there patience here, right? Is there self-control? Is there kindness, right? Like what's actually coming out of me here? What's on? Are we drawing closer together, right, in an appropriate way, right? Am I being what I should in right relation to my mom, right? Or am I creating further divisions, dissensions, arguments, so on and so forth, right? And then that gives me a sense of the yokes that are happening, or the honesty about where my eye, the eye of my heart is actually pointed. So I'm re-aiming. Oh, okay, this is getting a little contentious. Definitely. Re-aim.
And this is both the thing that makes you most adaptive and also the thing most potentially self-deceptive. And then that brings us back to familiarity brings contempt. And then the patterns and the, what did Luke say? Something about the people that you love the most are the people you hate the most. And so there's something about meaning that's valent and valuable that is of the same polarity, where love and hate can just kind of flip the polarity. Whereas like not caring about something is actually more of the opposite than love and hate. And so there's something about the way that we think about things that sets our emotional tone. And in that emotional tone, based on whether the map and territory match, that creates an emotional charge. And so we need to find things significant enough to emotionally charge us to change us, but not things that are so different that disorient us and make us lose our minds. And so there's a weird paradox of holding on to ways that orient you, but still being allowed to blow up and be disoriented. And there's something about that literally doesn't make sense. And that's why it requires faith. Like you can't reason your way through a transformative experience. Like you can't, like, I don't know, that's why it requires faith. That's why this is a return to faith. This is why this is using a whole bunch of propositions to get out of the proposition, to use a bunch of rationality to use a bunch of reasons to not be reasonable, to act in faith, to believe. And that's a totally different spirit of engagement. Like I was saying, that's a different mode of being. Instead of knowing what you're doing, believing in something inspiring is a whole different world. It's a whole different mode of being. You're a different person in that situation. And therefore, by believing in that spirit, you can just in an instant change the significance of the world, the significance of that moment. And so we need to remember that we're all creators of the significance of the moment in this weird, strange loop of sapiential frameworks, and not to get lost and confused in proximal identities, because it's that identity which changes identities that is our identity, not any temporary, oh, I'm the boss, I'm the father, I'm the student, I'm the, you know what I mean? All of these different roles help us orient and help people know how to interact with us. But they don't define us. They don't limit us. They don't confine us. So they ought not to. We ought to be identifying with the spirit that is not confined.
In that conceptualization of belief, I find myself thinking a lot these days about faithfulness, which is what Father Stephen DeYoung likes to point at anytime any variation of epistis is used, for like epistemology, epistis, right? So there is it's not quite like in your heart, really, really, truly, honestly. It's an actualization, right? And so is there a faithfulness, a loyalty to that light actually happening?
I'm not sure if I understand your question, but it sort of sounded to me like you get inspired to do something and then you manifest that energy into the actual. And then once you've manifested that energy into the actual, it collapses into less than ideal. And then that less than ideal object becomes real in your mind. And then you try to live given the objects of your intuition. And then when you use that object, I don't know, shit, I got lost. Did that make sense though?
Yeah, I think so. At least for me, the way it plays out, like kind of more tactically, is like, okay, so I'm in this conversation with mom, and then I really am having to watch, like, what's happening, how's she reacting, how do I feel, what's coming out of me, like, am I provoked, like, so what's going on here, what are the fruits of what's happening? Is mom, frustrated and ready to kick me out of the house, or are we like really excited to have dinner together? And so
Right.
depending on the testing that's going on there of what fruits are actually being displayed gives me a sense of the yoke that's been taken on, and whether something has to die in real time in order to reorient, re-aim, and pray that I stop being stupid and that something better might work through me.
I don't know, man. That's a great question. I'm not sure where those lines of identity draw and where our lines of influencing that identity is. And yeah, I don't know. It's a good question.
Well, I think wrestling with that passage in Romans 7, where Paul says, it's not I who does what I hate or whatever, but it's the sin living in me.
Mm-hmm.
And so that as you progress in Christ, you begin to recognize that more in yourself. The problem is that we want to look at somebody else and we don't want to identify what we don't like about them with the sin in them. If we choose to identify the part we don't like as the them, then we're in a place of conflict. So it's like just that continual work of recognizing that that duality and inability is that we fight within ourselves is also present in others, and then we can wrestle between what we must forgive, because well, I guess you can Christ helps us to forgive regardless without understanding, but it becomes much easier for us to forgive that which we do understand, because we've wrestled through it
So
ourselves.
there's something about seeing the world through glasses there where you forget that you're seeing the world through glasses. And so Vervaeke talks about taking off your glasses and looking at them rather than looking through them. And so our beliefs about ourselves are like the glasses that we project the world through, the lenses we filter the world through. And so there's something about living in the world and being damaged by sin that causes your glasses to, I don't know, misrepresent the world for you. And so we live through glasses of misinterpreting the world all the time. And but we can't see it because that's how we're seeing the world. Like, that's how it's appearing. We don't see something pure and then see something with a scratch. We just see it already broken. And so it is almost impossible in a certain way for our egos to see our flaws. That's almost technically impossible. And so that's why it requires some sort of cognitive flexibility to be able to step outside of these different frameworks. And so to your point earlier, it's a lot easier for us to see when somebody else is wearing glasses and it's confusing them, because we can see the world without their glasses, and then we can see them acting strangely. And so then we can infer there's something wrong with their glasses. We can infer there's something wrong with their belief systems. So it's really easy for us to say, hey, look, there's a difference between your belief system and your action, because I can see the contrast. But when we are living that ourselves, we are blinded by what we're talking about and blinded by the glasses that we're wearing. And so that's why this meditation is almost like a self-transcendent sort of experience, because you're taking off that which you already presumed coming into it. And those presumptive stances are often where your sins are. And so it's so much easier to see somebody else's presumptive stances than your own presumptive stance. Did that make any sense? Is that helpful?
Can I
Yeah, please go ahead, Tori. Please.
This might be slowing it down a little bit, but I'll try to keep it not too slow. So in again, I'll present the narrative as I see it so far, which is there's a sense, like I think I already did. What are you saying, Simone, is talking or giving a testimony to the blessings that's available to you, if you widen up and not stick to the narrow, more dogmatic or
Yeah, I think keeping your one unified way of looking at the world is guaranteed to make you miserable. And so there's something about agreeing to a diversity of opinion that undermines your initial previous thing, that then makes you more wise and makes you
but then
less fitting to the data.
What comes to mind is there are endless amounts of things to consider. So that the idea of what is it, combinatory explosion, I think that plays a role in massive way when talking
Massive.
about the right brain or the spirit of the right brain, and there has to be an animating principle of sorts that helps you navigate what to pay attention to and what to ignore. And I think that's the role of the left hemisphere does that in conjunction in relationship to the right brain. That's the marriage between the two that I see is you use the principle that you're aware of from the right brain, and you use that to engage what to keep and what not to keep. And in doing that, you're going to miss some things that were useful, and you're going to get some things that are useful, and you're going to get some things that are not so useful by sticking to your principle. All of those three things are constantly happening.
Yes.
But there is I don't see a way in which you can switch completely into embrace being possessed by the spirit of the right brain, for lack of a better word, into welcoming in all the information before acting.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that, and I totally vibe with that. And I think there's something that I was trying to get to earlier, where oh God, how do I put this? If you read McGilchrist, it basically sounds like he's demonizing the left hemisphere and glorifying the right hemisphere. But I think that's just relative to his presumed audience. And so I think that's where we need to get into the nature of the zeitgeist of the culture. And the metaphorical substrate that we typically use is so objective that we just assume we're objective. And there's something about that that's really wrong. And so when McGilchrist is talking, and when I'm trying to channel that, I'm basically trying to object to the status quo that assumes objectivity is everything. And therefore I'm saying, hey, we need to get into subjectivity. I'm not actually saying we need to abandon objectivity. I'm not saying the left hemisphere is wrong. I'm not saying the left hemisphere is evil. Oh, wait, maybe by associating it with Satan, I did say it was evil. But, maybe I think yin yang. Like, that's why everything is bipolar. And I'm not saying that evil is wrong. I'm saying that everything is a yin and a yang. And so to elucidate the yin and elucidate the yang, I think is really important. And so I will often characteristically glorify the right hemisphere and demonize the left hemisphere. However, I am not actually trying to imply we should be right hemisphere 90% and left hemisphere 10%. There's got to be that either or and both and. There's got to be that balance of polarity. But I think given the metaphorical substrate, it's helpful to be more critical of the left and more glorifying of the right. However, that would be totally to misrepresent my actual point.
Well, once you get past the idea that like you are choosing a paradigm because it's the one true paradigm or whatever, and you realize that there is this like multiplicity of paradigms, there's still great value in submitting to one and choosing that one for indefinitely or whatever.
Monotheism is better than polytheism in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean it's the same thing. It's like you can be in the mode of like getting to know a lot of girls. Once you get married, you need to get out of that other mode of getting to know a lot of girls and just stay with the one. Like that's and that just now I don't have to worry about what it would be like to be with somebody else or whatever. Like, and and you can do the same thing with churches or whatever. And so sometimes you might, which is almost like it's like, it's this paradoxical thing where it's like PVK is like the evangelical and the Protestant, but he's staying in his church because of the tradition and his family's being there, and kind of like if it ain't broke, why fix it? You know, if you can see it for what it is from within, which is possible. You know, I think that's kind of a great thing about this kind of ability that we have now with the internet to explore paradigms without. It's so much less costly to explore other paradigms than it used to be. So, you know, we can gain that perspective. It's still really good to be in one and stick with it, even if you don't agree with everything in it.
Two things, and then I got to bounce, Jen. Sorry. One, Mr. Satori, that reminds me of how St. Paul is going. All right, look, if you are Jewish and you're going to be a disciple of Christ, there are, what is a sin for you is different than the Gentiles who are discipling Christ. Like, what's localized within your communities are different, but you're also bound together. Both things are true at the same time. It's the resolution between the one and the many in some sense, right? Like,
Yeah.
it is the universal and it is the local. So there's that, and then the other thing that comes to mind is, like, yes, there's an openness internally that we have to have about analyzing or checking ourselves, let's say. But I think that there's a crucialness in the neighbor, in the love for the neighbor part, which is that the neighbor has to be there, gathered together in a spirit of play in Christ, because you do have fuzzy vision. There is a plank in your eye. There's crap in your eye, and you don't even know that there's crap in your eye because it's your eye. That's how you see, and that's just how you think you see. And so I need my mom, she's getting a lot of play today. I need my mom to point out the crap in my eye, right, to help me get it out. She needs me to do the same, but it has to be in that spirit of gentleness and love, not thinking that I'm above her, not thinking that she's above me. We're gathered together in Christ, so that the neighbor is crucial for that plucking crap out of each other's eye.
So I think that's partially what is implied by the phrase, where three or more are gathered in my name, I'll be there. There's something about when multiple people come together with the spiritual intent not to reaffirm what they already know, but to intermix and adapt and grow and change. I think there's a sort of reorienting communal spirit that knocks you out of your Luciferian temptations. And so I think that sort of willingness to not overfit to your own data and to conform, to agree to somebody else's perspective, there's something in there that's like inherently empathetic or inherently non-narcissistic or something like that is curative or redemptive to the left hemisphere tendency towards abstract Luciferian narcissistic thinking that has domicided or killed the communities or created this Tower of Babel of non-communal language. We need to reconnect somehow.
Is it the commitment to the left brain spirit that sort of killed the communities and all of the things you said, or is it committing to the wrong left brain spirits?
I think it's more the latter. So there was something that you were saying earlier, and I want to get back to the McGilchrist maneuver, which is like a right, left, right. And so there's something about, you're supposed to come into a situation openly, and then you experience stuff. And then there's something in your psyche that recognizes that. And there's a pattern recognition that then like transmits it into an image. And then that image is given to your left hemisphere. And then your left hemisphere takes that image and acts as if it's gospel. And then your left hemisphere structures the world based on that. And then I think you're supposed to go with that structure, with that lens of perception that's kind of tainting your vision, but not 100% determining it. You kind of come into that next moment with that lens of perception. And then you use that right hemisphere openness again. And I think what the issue is when we take that left hemisphere for granted, and then we don't give it back to the right. It's like when we take the left hemisphere and then assume that representation is sufficient for motivation. However, the representation should always be used as a lens to interpret the future. And then it's the actual interpretation that should be the real motivator of your attention, not needing to conform to the left hemisphere idea. And so we need left hemispheric ideas, but that can't be the end of the story. I think the story needs to start and end in the right hemisphere. But we cannot diminish the role of the left. The left is absolutely crucial. It gets us all of 5G and space and the internet, and that's the whole reason we can talk, is because the left hemisphere has been able to manage this stuff. But if we glorify the left hemisphere for its own sake, I think we will inherently miss the mark. And so I think we theoretically need to pay more attention to the right hemisphere and allow the left hemisphere to receive the implanted world from the right hemisphere, rather than presume the left hemisphere is right and then try to remake the world in the image of that left hemispheric assumption. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's why you got to give your left hemisphere construction projects to work on, and then it's satisfied and it doesn't try to rule your life.
Yeah, idle hands are the devil's playthings. Keep those idle hands oriented towards the good and being productive. Something like that.
To sort of try to wind this back to where Luke started earlier. It sounds to me from what you're saying that the crime that the left hemisphere is charged with is not being hospitable to the stranger that the right hemisphere recommends. Is that a fair way of putting the critique?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say on the worldviews that whenever they create some category of like non-persons, that's when you get into really dangerous territory. So, like that, and I think that's what the left hemisphere is tempted to do for the sake of understanding the world. Like, because it's how it regards to people. People are the most complex and confusing thing about the world. Like if there wasn't any people, your left brain would probably not be such a problem. But categorizing people really runs into problems.
Tayo, can you ask that question again?
Well, I remember because I sort of was drawn into what Michael was saying, and I was on that track. I think let me try to remember.
Because I had a good response and then I forgot it.
So if you could just trigger me. I basically presented what the left hemisphere is charged with is not being hospitable.
Okay, so that gets me into the McGill-Christian. He tries to characterize the different hemispheres. He gives them different attitudes or different dispositions. And so they're actually wired differently. They almost have a different personality. And there's something about the personality of the left hemisphere that, given the fact that it thinks it's sufficient, it assumes that its information is sufficient. And therefore it has a resistance complex of a membrane that rejects everything else. And so there's something characteristic about the left hemisphere that is selfish and is ignorant and builds a wall, says, I'm not listening to you, you're on the other side of the wall. And that's the human arbitrary that says, this is my family and that's my enemy. This is myself and that's my boss. And I'm going to tell the truth, I'm going to lie. And that difference in arbitration, I think, is really significant. To contrast that, again, the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao, and trying to describe the right hemisphere is always going to be foolish. But here we are. But there's something characteristic about the right hemisphere that recognizes that it doesn't know. And so it seeks guidance from outside. And so if you have two different hemispheres and you're theoretically giving attention to either chamber, if you give your attention to the right chamber, it recognizes the need for the left and will spread out and use the whole brain to solve the problem. If instead you give your energy to the left hemisphere is like, oh, I already know this. Fuck the right hemisphere. Here's the answer. And there's something about that is dispositionally, characteristically, attitudinally, spiritualistically selfish, and then ignorant. And then there's something about being selfish and ignorant that isn't loving and adaptive. And so there's some sort of contrast where you need something that isn't selfish and separate and ignorant and entitled. If that's the only thing dominating your consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, it was the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere was in the driver's seat when the man asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor?" Because he was looking for a definition of who to
Correct.
exclude.
That's how I would interpret that. Yes. He was already asking in the frame of the left hemisphere, hey, give me an answer that my left hemisphere pattern recognizer will recognize given my left hemispheric assumptions. And I think that's the Tower of Babel that we're in. We're like, hey, I have this left hemispheric construction and I have a problem. And I think the answer is something like, well, it's in your left hemispheric construction. It's like, it's in the words you have already taken for granted.
Okay, so we've got someone backstage. I don't know if he will come on, but he's a very pronounced McGilchrist critic in the Discord, and he's had conversations with a few people about his critiques with McGilchrist. And I think Simon, you'd be someone good to have that conversation with. Marcha, when you're ready, I need to know that your mic is connected before I can add you to the stage. But until then, do carry on. I guess let me let me try to like it's I think you're right, Simone, by with the disclaimer that it's sort of oxymoronic to try to talk about the right hemisphere.
Yeah, this is by definition misleading, and so it requires a lot of faith in the audience to see beyond the literal of what is being said. There's some sort of imaginary process that requires revivifying the words as spoken, and there's something about our modern culture that kind of autistically wants to separate it out and delineate it and know everything and specify it. That kind of misses the point. And to answer in that spirit would be to feed the wolf that misses the point. And so almost by gratifying that, you're almost feeding the disorientation.
Yeah, so because of that, I sort of want to, instead of talking about either right or left hemisphere, talking about the brain instead. And that's sort of where I started the critique from earlier, because we can get... I think Nico left the comment that the only way to talk about the relationship between two things is through a third thing. And the left and the right hemisphere have a relationship because they're parts of a whole called the brain. And there's a way in which the brain doesn't function ever with only just the left hemisphere.
So
and when it does, there's a specific characteristic that shows.
Yeah, I think there's something about the metaphor, the Christian metaphor of the Trinity of experience, as well as the Taoist metaphor of the Trinity of the yin yang and the one. And there's something about when we're talking about this McGilchristian theory of the hemispheres, it very much sounds like a left and right. It very much sounds like a yin and yang. But unfortunately, that actually implies a trinity of existence. And so we're using a false dichotomy to actually elucidate a trinity of experience. And that's kind of a mindfuck for a lot of people. And so, yeah, it's difficult. I don't know how to manage that line very well. I actually struggle with that a lot, to be honest. So.
Jacob, my good friend, good to see you.
Hello, Tayo. So I'm going to be a little bit rude and say I came on because in half an hour, Trip and I are going to be discussing Calvin Robinson. And I was hoping Michael would be able to join us. And I was kind of hoping you guys might be done with your stream by then. Because we've been having a kind of discussion on Twitter. Trip and I and Bethel got involved, and I think it's an important issue. So, yeah, sorry to be rude.
So, do you have a time when saying 30 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay.
I really was hoping, because I think Michael might be a good bridge in that discussion. If Michael could possibly join us.
So you came on, Jacob, to poach one of our
do a little real work, and then I can jump in probably.
Jacob, you came on to poach one of our star contributor with the epic beard.
I mean, yeah, I gotta I gotta go anyway, but I'll be around. But
Okay. Well, I've got a bit of time. If you do see money to keep this going while Jacob preps for his, is it going to be titled "Jacob Destroys Calvinists with Facts and Logic," or what are we going with?
not Calvinism, but
it's probably just going to be named Calvin Robinson Defrocked, because that's what happened. He was his license has been removed, and he actually, funny enough, that makes him subject to deportation. So people have been laughing about that just a little bit. Anyway, I got to go, and I can barely hear you guys. So anybody who wants to come in half an hour. Later.
Okay, thank you, Jacob. Love you, bro. I think he's gone. Oh, is Marcho backstage? He is, but there's no mic connected, so I can't add you to the stage, bro. Michael, before you do end up going over to the Jacob Pratt-to-Richard stream that starts in 25 minutes or so, any final words on what we've been talking about so far?
I don't know. I think it's fun. I think it's fun that there's so many different paradigms. Once you don't have to have them in a culture war, it's fun to learn about them. So, and the more you learn about them, the more people you can hopefully relate to. So that's why I'm here.
I think there's something about the paradigm of how we talk that turns it into a war and then turns it into a competition. And we forget that we're trying to triangulate towards truth. And that sets us up for a lot of confusion, I think.
What is it about the paradigm that forces us into that way of conversation?
I don't know, man. I think there's a lot of factors to it, and to try to specify them out, I don't know. I'm not ready for that right now.
Because I think my claim to fame in this part is being an estuary leader across the pond. So I've had a lot of experience in listening to and participating in conversations of various kind, and even when conversations aren't necessarily set in debate mode or war mode, there is the fact of I want you to understand or be able to comprehend what I'm saying, and in order to do that, if there are presuppositions that you hold that's stopping you, you're going to have to sacrifice that to be able to listen to what I'm presenting. So even when it's done, done winsomely, there is a war of words going on, and yeah, okay, finally, okay, thanks, Michael. This is a big day for the Discord voice chat, because March is coming out of the lurk. Is very, very well known over there on the Bridges of Meaning, formerly of the BOM, currently on the Broken Clock Tower. Marcher, McGilchrist. First of all, how did you come into contact with McGilchrist's ideas? Let's start there. Marcher, if you can unmute. It seems he's still having technical problems. He can't hear the sound.
Hey, Teo. Hey, Simone. How you guys doing?
Still having technical problems.
Hey, there he is.
Can you guys hear me? Hey, Teo. Hey, Simone. How you guys doing?
Yourself. Close the tab, bro. Come on, man. I know it's your first time, but
I can't hear you guys. Hold on.
Oh, gosh. It's almost like we've got Ron and Mark Parker on stream.
There we go. I can hear you guys now.
We're good now?
Sweet.
Yeah, the question I asked you was, how did you come across McGilchrist, and is the idea that it was presenting?
You're asking me, Teo?
Yeah.
I was first introduced to McGilchrist through Peterson, I think. It's been so long ago, I don't remember. He's so ubiquitous now, right? I don't remember, really.
So what brought you on here today? What were we talking about that got you all charged up?
Well, I wanted to ask you some questions, right? Because it might help to clarify a bit before we dive into the details. Perhaps it would help if I gave an example, right? So a few months ago, we were hanging out in the Discord like we usually do, and a newcomer came into the voice chat. I won't say who he is, but he came in at a good time because there were a lot of streamers in the voice chat. Chad was in there. I think Sherry was in there. It became clear that this newcomer was a gay man in a relationship, and he was the, I guess, stepdad to his partner's son. Really quickly into the conversation, the wagons kind of circled around him, and it became clear that most of the people in the voice chat were opposed to homosexuality. And there was this back and forth. And then there was a crucial turn that I'll never forget. He said, well, you guys have your propositions and I have my experience. Okay. So I'm wondering how this shakes out in a McGill-Christian framework. Was he being more left brain or right brain there? And were his critics being more left brain or right brain there? It seems to me that when they were discussing homosexuality from their Christian point of view, they were doing it from within a conceptual framework to understand his experience in the light of some apprehended telos, some good that we're trying to approach in truth.
Okay.
Now, I guess you could understand how that would be seen as simultaneously, on the one hand, left brain by the newcomer, but by them it would be seen as right brain. Over time, I began to see that the way these distinctions are deployed is actually very ideological. The thing that you like is right brain, and the thing that you don't like is left brain. Without like a metaphysical grounding, I don't see how this McGill-Christian framework devolves into disguising these in-group, out-group dynamics, actually.
Ooh, okay, that's quite a question. So I think there's something paradoxical here that can't be separated out and objectified. So there's something about, and obviously I wasn't here, I wasn't in this dynamic. I'm really just trying to guess and recreate based on the skeleton of the conversation you just gave me. So there's something about orienting a philosophical or religious conversation that uses symbolism like male and female and uses symbolism like procreation to orient towards meaning and to guide a certain spirit. And so in a situation like that, a lot of times there are relative values given to either cohesion or diversity. And so in a lot of ways, you're trying to orient a conversation around cohesion. And so in a weird way, that excludes diversity. And so in a weird way, if you're theoretically talking about purity, you could very well, in good conscience, demonize homosexuality, whilst at the same time having good friends that are homosexual or having actual homosexual tendencies yourself. It's not, there's a difference between the concepts of male and female and of sexual union and in the practicality of it. And so when we start talking about, is this left brain or is this right brain? I think the answer is always technically both. I think the McGill-Christian theory is that because we're so primarily left brain, we no longer charge those left brain things with meaning and experience, and then we just treat them as left hemisphere right or wrongs. There's no longer an embodied polarity of situational relevance. And so we identify in certain ways, and then we get rejected by our theories, and then we get butthurt by that. But there's a problem about taking a theory and then trying to inject your body into it and then finding a confusion and then blaming the philosophy. Shit, I don't know. Did that help at all, or did I just ramble?
I hear you, but I don't quite know where you shake out. So if I was like a progressive Christian or even just a progressive, I could use this framework and deploy it against the Christian on their views on homosexuality. So they have these concepts of man woman.
Sure.
They have these concepts of what the purpose of sexuality is. And then I can accuse you of reifying those concepts and denying the experience that I have as a progressive person. So it seems to me, though, that there's a role that's being missed here in the McGill-Christian framework that, if it's not taken into account, can be deployed in all sorts of ways because it's unmoored from a metaphysical grounding, from a true, properly philosophical.
I think that's the whole point, though, is that the left hemisphere is inherently unmoored. And so to believe in the left hemisphere is to place your moral compass in something that is unmoored from humanity.
But notice how we are stipulating our morality, coming to know it, be conformed by it, is by a metaphysical notion apprehended through reasoning. So the very light in which I'm constituting my experience and trying to conform it to the good in truth is something that on the McGill-Christian framework, it gets glossed often and was glossed on this stream earlier as left brain.
So so there's something about the left hemisphere that is a useful emissary but a horrible master. And so there's absolutely use and beauty and benefit to the left hemisphere. The problem is that when the person using it presumes it as sufficient, there's a characteristic inspiration that is like a spirit of interpretation that can get lost when the left hemisphere assumes its totality, when it isn't put in proper function, when it isn't put in its proper place. And so, yeah, I don't know how to explain this because we have to talk in left brain words, but then the left brain words.
Well, that's what I mean. It's like, what do you mean?
What's that?
I get really confused. Yeah, I get really confused when we talk this way because it seems to me that as we're trying to understand each other, right, we're doing so in the light of some apprehended intelligibility, and we're trying to work towards that unity.
Yeah.
So there's a both and happening that's irreducible. Right.
Okay.
I continue to see only problems in locating to diverse sources different modes of thought. Some modes of thought are more holistic, but as we try to clarify what is implicit, this is another thing that McGill-Christ demonizes, right? The move to go from implicit to explicit. But that's what we're trying to do right now. We're going from
I think we need to do it in proper balance.
We're going from an implicit intelligibility, trying to bring it out in discourse and dialogue to make it more explicit so that we can approach an apprehended good in truth through this making explicit of what is implicit. As long as this disagreement of our principles remains implicit, resolution eludes us.
Yeah,
that's the very thing that gets glossed as left brain, as the thing that divides us.
That's why I'm trying to say that left hemisphere isn't wrong. It's only wrong if the person.
Well, I'm saying that it's a mistake to even gloss it as left brain because it's a move towards unity. It's a distinction in unity.
Right, but it's still a distinction. We have to talk about a distinction, so we clarify the distinction. The fact that distinction signifies something to the unity should be obvious. Like that burden on the interpretation is on the audience.
In the light of unity, and it may or may not resolve towards unity, recurse back to unity, in which case that would be a problem. But notice also, it seems to me that, again, whether or not we have a true unity is something that's apprehended in the light of reasoning. You know, the new atheists have a unity of sorts. It's just that their unity happens to be wrong. They're resolving their principles to a unity that happens to be just too small. That isn't right. That isn't conformed to being. So it's like they're working within unities of sorts. It's just that their unities happen to be not conformed to the real. So it's like glossing everything they do as left brain. Glossing everything they do as left brain is just an ideological move.
I mean, if you interpret it that way, sure, but I don't think it necessarily has to be interpreted that way. I think the meaning is in the interpretation, honestly. I don't think the meaning is in the objective word, and I think that's actually the spirit of the objection. I think that's actually your answer. Yeah.
So there's an interpretive act that's. I mean, this is kind of why I think that the framework is just so problematic, right? Even apprehended units,
very problematic framework. I'll agree with that.
That even come to us through experience are interpreted in the light of some unity we've apprehended. Things like our beliefs, which are convictions in the truth of a proposition. So even the propositional is involved right there at the beginning in constituting the intelligible content of and meaningful content of our experience.
It is structuring the limitations of which we can play with.
Before you go again, I'm with Nico. This is going very fast. I don't know if it's going too fast for you to be able to see money, for you to be able to sort of respond in time. But for me, I'm going to slow it down and ask some questions for lower level people that both of you can probably answer. So it seems to me that there's an agreement that there's for unity between the left and the right brain. Neither of you are proposing let's team right brain or team left brain. I think I
say abolish the distinction.
Yes. I'm saying that the distinction is where the significance of the unity lies. And so I think the distinction is necessary as long as it's put in proper context, as long as we realize that the one is most important. But there's still
that's to me is a complete non-starter.
Okay,
right?
so
the goal is to acquire unity, and we're locating it in a part. We're locating it in one of the parts as its primary function. I mean, the whole thing is a reductionistic kind of like Trojan horse from the beginning. It's actually kind of like, I don't know.
Right. That's the intellect. That's what we're using to talk. That's the mammon. That's the speech that we're using. That's the fallen medium of conversation. That's not in the spirit of the conversation itself. That's just
I think it's just the wrong
medium.
Okay,
hold on. I think it's the problem of the framework.
See, money. What does you said it's the problem is not the left brain. The problem is when the left brain becomes the master. It's a good emissary but horrible master. What does the right brain being the master look like? And how does that achieve unity?
I don't know, but it's something like formless, something like ever-changing, something like adaptive, something like responsive, something like undetermined, something like indefinable, something like I have no idea.
And I think that's is the only answer that can be given how you've put forward the right brain as being so far, is you can never have any idea.
I don't think so. No, I don't think you can specify it.
So we don't want specificity. We want non-specificity to be the master, and specificity to be the
specifying non-specificity. I mean, this is just getting.
Do you see that sort of improper balance that I'm sort of pointing at? That we're leading with non-specificity and making specificity the slave. When in order to communicate, what's needed, like Macho was alluding to, is for us to make intelligible the unintelligible. And that's why I said earlier that this framework is terrible for communication. Because
it has lots of other problems too, right? But I think it sells the view short. I think people can get a misunderstood gloss that way, Teo. It's like what was said earlier, right? It's like the more we insist on our paradigms, the more we narrow our view, right? I think that's what was said more or less earlier in the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, I'll agree with that.
I was listening to the European Conservatives, I think, Sophia podcast with Sebastian Morello. It's a very good podcast. I think you guys should check it out. His conversation with Thomas Pink in the first half was very good. They were talking about rationality. Very interesting biblical conversation there too, with respect to the fall of the angels. And he said something which is just part of the classical tradition, right? Reason is the capacity to become more susceptible to the force of the true and the good. As you use it, there's a narrowing, right? Like we talk about the force of an argument, right? There's a real force. And as we use rationality as classically understood, you become more susceptible to that force, and therefore your possibilities narrow. But in becoming more susceptible to the true and the good, you become more free. Your actually possibilities expand. So there, if the paradigm that you're insisting on happens to be conformed unto the architectonic principles of the real, then you become more free. So implicitly in this framework too, it's just kind of why ironic, implicitly in this McGilchrestian framework, there's an inherent skepticism that that's even possible, that you can come into a knowledge of the intelligibility of things in themselves. And that even to say that you can come into that knowledge is a kind of hubris.
Right. And that's what I was trying to get at. The Adam and Eve story is like to me, is the transition from, I don't know, Homo erectus into Homo sapien. It's like when we started to believe that our ideas were the most important thing. There's something about that.
But that's the objection of the newcomer, right? Who says you have your ideas with respect to what sexuality is and what relationships should be, and I have my experience. That's the objection. He's making that skeptical move, that you can come to know the intelligibility of things and rightly order them and be conformed unto a good apprehended that you pursue in truth.
Whoa, that's where it gets slippery though, is because once you try to objectify it out like that, it then becomes not true. Like if your aim is to, if the goal of life is to aim, and life is constantly in motion, then your ability to aim needs to be always in motion. There's no such thing as like, hey, move the compass 85 degrees northeast and put 50% power on it, and that's where the target is. There's no calculatable way to get there. You have to be sensing in adjusting.
I think that's fine if you're secular. If you're a Christian, I don't know how much of that you can buy.
Yeah, this what I'm hearing you express is actually a modernist skepticism that actually has almost nothing to do with the classical metaphysics, how we come to know the intelligibility of things in themselves, and that this doesn't actually narrow us to refining our perspective. It actually opens us up to greater possibilities in unity.
Yeah, I think this gets pedantic about what is meaningful and what is logos and what is intelligible and what is knowledge and what matters. There's a difference between what matters practically and what significance is action, and then what matters in the sense of what makes sense.
It wasn't pedantic for that gay man, right? It wasn't pedantic for him. I mean, those things had real consequences for how he understood his own identity and what he was doing. Right. And it was so easy for him to deploy this framework against the Christians who were using this framework to support their own Christianity.
Before we see, like, I don't think McGilchrist proposed to be a Christian. Christians also use this framework to support as a apologetics tool. But just sticking to the philosophy that the framework proposes. And Simone, you've sort of talked about the usefulness of this framework in explaining a shift in the culture that you feel and a lot of people also talk about, which is their sort of left brain tyranny is how it's sort of framed. But what it really comes down to is the choosing to be conservative over being innovative. Would that be a fair way of sort of?
In
that?
Dude, I don't know, man. Because I think technically the Christ spirit is the updating spirit, and so I think that's the revolutionary spirit. I think it's that which updates the paradigms, and so that's where like kind of the Gnostic interpretation comes in. Like, is Lucifer the wrong person for bringing knowledge, or is that the good thing for bringing knowledge? Well, it depends how we use that knowledge. If we take that abstract knowledge and we presume that it is sufficient, well, then we're Lucifer and we are choosing to orient ourselves towards an anti-life philosophy. If we are using new information to reconstrue the paradigm and reconstrue our ego and to reorient us and to adapt meaningfully, well, then I think that has potential for evolutionary change. And so I think if you were to just say liberal or conservative, or changing or conservative, I think you would have to put Christ as the changing. But it's also the orienting, unifying spirit of the monoculture of the Western civilization. And so in that sense, it's very much the conservative. And so it's a paradox. And so it depends on where you're coming from and what you mean by these words. And so it's really hard to make a clear distinction. This symbolically is right and this is wrong, or this is good and this is evil, or this is left and this is right. And so these dichotomies that we have to use to speak inherently open us up to a lot of confusion. And I really don't know how to manage that very well, clearly.
Well, this has been great, but I am going to have to shut this down, and Marcher's leaving as well. So final words, Marcher, and then...
Cool.
Thanks to the host, Luke, who's not here. Sorry for coming onto your channel. And, while you're not here, I wish I could have talked to you. But Simone, thanks for the engagement also. It was great. And Teo, good mediator as usual. So I have to go to work, guys. Sorry, but I have to get ready.
Thank you, Marcher. It was a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Marcher. Yeah, thanks for coming on and disagreeing, giving me some pushback.
And Simone, thank you. I mean, you've dived into this head first, and you're having really engaging conversations with people. There was so I really appreciate seeing you on screen, and getting to play with you today has been really fun also.
Yeah, thanks Luke for opening this up, and thank you guys for letting me talk. I know I'm saying a lot of stuff, and you guys are probably going to disagree with a lot of it, but most of it is not something that I'm hard and fast on and telling you how it is. I'm kind of just trying to sound it out as we go. So it is helpful to get some feedback. Like, I don't think I'm out here telling you guys how it is. I feel like I'm trying to kind of sound it out with you. But a lot of times that carries on some sort of tone of like, I know what it is and I'm telling you how it is, and I'm speaking in all these left hemispheric concepts and being real arrogant and certain, and that just like totally confuses the spirit of what I'm trying to do. And so just thank you for letting me come out here and fail in front of y'all, and maybe we can improve this whole process a little bit.
That's amazing. Thank you for coming on to play and wrestle. It's been good fun.
Cool.
And
I
also,
appreciate the playtime. It was fun, guys.
Thank you to Grail Country and to Luke for giving me access to be able to help with this. And also, just want to highlight this comment that this Marcher coming on is an example of someone who's one of us but disagrees with us, but can still play with us. And Grail Country is a good place to do that. So as long as they're open enough to have people that disagree with them come on and talk to them, I'll be a part of this. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye.